I wanted to share a story from the first house that my wife and I bought back in 2011. We wanted to find our first home that we could really make our own. We ended up finding and falling in love with this 1960s ranch in what seemed like a quiet suburban neighborhood. The price was within our budget, which was a surprise based on the house, but it did also need some work. That didn't deter us, however, because we were looking forward to fixing it up together, really getting to put our love into it and our own spin on things. It even had a huge backyard where we planned to build a screened-in porch for our 3 cats to enjoy. The bones of the house were solid, per the inspector. It just kind of needed some TLC. The move-in went smoothly. We had plenty of help from family and friends. We met our neighbors across the street, who was an older lady. She seemed very sweet and talkative when we met her. And she told us the person that owned the house before us was an older guy, and she thinks that he passed away. From what I could see on the seller's paperwork, it was a younger person, so I think it was the parents' home and she sold it. The house on our left was an older couple who kept to themselves, but they waved when they saw us. The house on the right, however, was a bit different. We'd see all different people coming and going at all hours of the day. Some people were dropped off. Some were wearing normal clothes, others in nice pants and shirts. We figured that it was maybe a rental with high turnover, or maybe even something like an Airbnb or adult kids moving in and out. Either way, it wasn't really our business. They didn't bother us either, so we just left it alone. We started our repairs soon after moving in, starting on the things that needed to be fixed first. That's when we first noticed our cats acting weird. Well, if you have cats, it's probably not really weird, but you'll understand. All 3 of them would be in the living room, sometimes sitting on the floor or the couch, and would be staring at the wall. At first, I thought they saw a bug on the wall. I went over to look for it, not wanting them to try and eat it if it was dangerous, but I never found any. I figured it had probably crawled into some crevice, behind a shelf, or somewhere out of my view. But this behavior became pretty consistent for them. It didn't happen every day, but when it did, we noticed, because of how all of them reacted. I was used to that behavior from my 2 younger cats, but my older guy didn't really care for that kind of stuff anymore. So when whatever it was had his attention, I knew that I needed to pay more attention. I started to wonder if maybe they saw or heard mice. It was an older house, so it was entirely possible. And with how long they would sit there and stare at the wall and floor, I was starting to fear that it was mice. So, after about a week of that, my wife and I finally heard a slight scratching sound while in the kitchen, and noticed the cats once again staring at the wall. It moved along the wall from the living room toward the back of the house, so I was pretty well convinced we had a mouse. The next day, I went and got a bunch of traps, put them behind the fridge, under the cabinets, in the basement, and along the outside of the house. I checked them daily throughout that week, and we didn't catch a single one. So, either we didn't have mice, or they were too smart for the traps. Either way, the sounds continued, and we didn't know what else to do other than call pest control to make sure we didn't have a bigger problem. I told my wife that I would call someone, but admittedly, I kept forgetting to do it for a few days, especially since it didn't happen daily. Thankfully, she's not the type to nag me about something like that, but I also knew that we needed to get it done before we started making repairs outside. We certainly didn't want to trap something in. The following week, my wife was going to be away for 3 days because her mother was having a heart surgery. Her parents were older, and her dad already had a bad knee, so they were going to need some help when she got home. I did offer to go and help out, but she declined, saying I should stay home with the cats, not wanting to have to move them again even if it was temporary. We had moved about 4 hours away, which is why she was just going to stay there with her parents. It made sense, and also gave me some time to work on some things around the house, including calling that pest control person. She left on a Thursday morning, and I went to work as normal. I went home that evening, and as I sat in the living room alone, I started hearing that scratching sound again, reminding me to call. I called a local company, but they didn't answer. I assumed they may have been closed by then, so I left a message to make an appointment for the next day. In the meantime, I thought I would try to check it out and see if I could at least find the source, even if it meant I had to tear apart any sort of organization or unpacking we had done. I watched my cats as they stared at the wall again and followed as one of them stared at the floor. I got on my knees and listened for it. I heard slow, long scrapes. And then there were several short, fast ones at once. It seemed to be a bit clearer in the kitchen, and then off to the other side of the kitchen was the stairs to the basement. I went down the stairs and continued hearing the scratching toward the external wall. The basement was unfinished with concrete block walls and exposed ceiling joints, but if the owner was an old man, then it made sense. He probably didn't have a reason to finish it, or a need to. But as I got closer to the back wall and corner, that scratching got much more pronounced. But it was also a lot stronger than what I would expect from a mouse. Maybe a raccoon? A dog? I had no idea. But I knew that I was getting close to figuring out what it was. I reached the corner of the room where my basement window well was, and I saw some movement. My initial thought was maybe it was entering from there. The window had been pretty hidden as it was behind the house and partially covered by an overgrown bush that we hadn't trimmed yet. So I didn't even think to check it at that time. But the window itself didn't open up, so I'd have to go outside to catch our culprit. I went back upstairs, grabbed a flashlight, and walked out the front door and around to the back. Once I got to the back, I could hear the scratching clearly. That was definitely where it was coming from. But the worst part was that I no longer thought it was an animal. Along with the scratching, there were small grunts and almost a whine to it. Was there a person scratching at my wall? And yes, that's actually exactly what was happening. I moved aside part of the bush and I saw some of the siding bent upward. I pointed my flashlight at the bottom, and I saw a man's face with wide, bulging eyes staring back at me, sticking out from inside the wall of my house. Now, I do not feel good about this, but it was at that moment I freaked out, and I didn't know what I was doing. I threw my flashlight at the man's face, heard him yell, and then I ran back inside my home. I called the cops and reported that I thought there was a man breaking into my house. I could still hear the scratching from inside and was freaking the hell out. When the police finally arrived, I took them around back, and the man I saw was now almost completely out of the wall. The police helped pull the man out and asked if I recognized him, and I didn't have a clue who he was. They had me go back inside, and I gave them my statement there. Getting the whole story out that night was just as crazy. As it turns out, the man that was in my wall was one of our neighbors to the right, the ones that we really didn't know. That house was actually a halfway house for men transitioning out of prison, addiction treatment, or even some therapy clinics. The people we kept seeing were either the nurses and staff or the residents, which is why we saw the same people for several weeks, and then never again. The man in my wall, I'll call him Fred, had been suffering from some mental disorders and withdrawal, and when he was around too many people, he'd become overstimulated and such, and he left the house. He didn't go far as he realized he could use the window well to access the wall cavity. He pried up part of the siding, and him being such a scrawny guy, was able to pretty much shimmy in between the walls. There wasn't much room to do anything, other than stand there, or I guess in his case lie on his side, but he did it, and he claimed that it helped him calm down, to ground himself. Like I said, he'd been doing this for a couple months. Due to his condition, he was a long-term resident there, so when he had too much, he went to our house. No one ever caught him doing this, and no one had been living there, so it wasn't reported. We were just lucky enough to get the house and wanted to deal with the problem before it got worse. One of the cops there that night was familiar with Fred, and one of the staff members came over that night and apologized to me, and I overheard a lot of the conversation she had with the police. That's actually how I got a lot of the information above. After all was said and done, I didn't press charges, feeling bad that I gave him a nosebleed and possibly a black eye with the flashlight. One of the cops actually helped me press down the siding, and in the meantime, I went and screwed it to the wall a bunch as a temporary fix until I could get it fixed properly. I called my wife after everyone left and finally reported it all to her. She was kind of freaking out at first, but this was exactly why I was glad that I was home alone so she didn't have to witness it. Because, man, even though I know he was probably harmless, those eyes staring back at me, it was some real nightmare fuel. I slept with the TV turned up pretty loud so I couldn't hear anything around me. We ended up spending a pretty penny to have the entire perimeter wall passage professionally sealed and the basement secured. But at least we knew that that wouldn't happen again. I didn't see Fred after that. I assume he was probably transferred somewhere else since, sadly, they weren't a fit for him if he was able to leave when he shouldn't have. I do honestly hope that he's living in a better place, where he feels safer than he did in my walls. I've been a bartender for a very long time. Before I owned my own bar, I worked at various smaller ones while I went through more training and getting the necessary licenses needed to open my own. One of the places I worked at included this tiny music venue that held maybe 150 people max, with a stage that was basically just a raised platform in the back corner. The bar ran along one wall, and from my position I could pretty much see everything that happened in the place. That one was probably one of my favorites, because there was always some kind of event happening. I got paid to listen to some great music while mixing drinks and meeting many people. But then I've also been trapped there when the bands were pretty terrible, and would have clenched my teeth as I listened to off-key vocals and guitars that needed better tuning. But the customers typically kept me busy between making their drinks and corralling those who'd had too much to drink. Most nights were pretty standard. Local bands, regular crowd, typical bar drama. But there was one night that I would never forget. It was some kind of discount fall concert. There was a large one happening the week prior with some bigger and popular bands, and the venue I worked at was wanting to do something similar, but smaller, for those of us that couldn't dish out that kind of money, but still wanted to party. And they got 2 local bands and a popular cover band, so they did decently with the lineup, too. The concert started out pretty normal, and people getting drinks as they came in. I noticed this guy pretty quickly that was on a mission to get wasted and hit on every woman in the place. I was familiar with the type. Probably mid-30s, wearing a shirt that was too tight, sunglasses indoors, and a backwards cap. He was buying drinks for himself, and then offering to buy drinks for literally any woman who approached the bar. Like I said, I've seen his type before. The guy that thinks if he buys enough drinks, someone will be impressed by his generosity. What actually happens, more often than not, is he spends $200+ getting rejected all night while I collect his money and try not to laugh. This dude was particularly persistent, though. Every single woman who came to the bar got the same offer from him. A pretty smile, some kind of pickup line, and motions for me to get them another drink. The success rate was about what you'd expect. 0. But hey, his money was good. He was paying for everything up front, no tabs, so I kept serving him. My boss, the owner, had a pretty clear policy about when we could cut people off. Either at closing time, or if they were clearly too drunk to function, stumbling around, causing problems, and that kind of stuff. As long as someone could walk and wasn't being aggressive, the drinks could keep going. He also wasn't being aggressive to the women that he approached. If they said no or walked away, he let them go, not even trying to stop them. So, I guess he had some dignity. If he had done any of that, I would have been inclined to kick him out. I was the youngest kid with 3 sisters, a wife, and a young daughter, and I was raised to be pretty protective. This guy made it through the first band just fine. A little buzzed, but was handling himself okay. By the second band, he was definitely feeling it more, getting louder and more animated with his pickup attempts. The rejections were piling up, but he seemed to be taking them in stride, just moving on to the next woman with the same tired lines. Then came the break between the second and third bands. And that's when things started to pick up a bit. He came up to the bar and started making these weird requests. He wanted some kind of shot that you basically served on fire. I looked at him like he was crazy. I remember telling him, "Bro, this is a dive bar in a basement. We've got beer, shots, and basic mixed drinks. We don't deal with fire here." But he was just as persistent with me. He was begging me to just light one on fire for me, please. Just one. The girls will love it. I'll tip big. I stayed polite but firm and told him that it wasn't going to happen. We didn't have a setup for that kind of thing, and it wasn't safe. Finally, he gave up, ordered another beer, and wandered back toward the crowd. Not even 10 minutes later, he came back, empty-handed, asking for one more shot. Either he'd left his beer somewhere, or he had chugged it that fast. Either way, he was drinking too much. I didn't want to, but I knew I was going to have to cut him off. I gave him one more, hoping the band would start soon and distract him, but I told him that it was his last for the night. He nodded, telling me he understood, and slid to the end of the bar where 2 women had been sitting and talking. That's when things went downhill. He held up the shot, showing the woman, and I heard him say, "Hey, check this out." I was just beginning to help someone else when I heard him say it, so I turned to check. He had pulled out a lighter and was holding it toward the glass. I yelled at him to stop, already walking toward him, and he noticed. It was too late, though. He had lit the glass on fire, and clearly, having never done that before, he went to pour it in his mouth. And then he completely missed. In case you haven't before, there's a technique to drinking those. Immediately trying to toss it back is not the way to do it. This guy, however, was too intoxicated for anything that required technique. I wasn't fast enough, and as he poured it, missing his mouth, the whiskey and flames went across the lower half of his face and chest. The screaming was immediate and terrifying. It was the kind of screams you hear in movies and shows. This was raw primal terror and pain coming straight from this man. He started running around the bar area, batting at his face and chest, which only made it worse, spreading the flames around, as you could imagine. You'd think someone would remember the old stop, drop, and roll from elementary school, but not quite when you're drunk and panicking. This guy was just running in circles, and I was trying to find the best way to jump in and put him out. The crowd really wasn't much help either. Most of them were just trying to stay away from him, while a handful of people holding water bottles shook it out towards him, not doing much but making the floor wet. Finally, I was able to find a good opening, and as he ran past me, I tackled him to the ground, patting him with my damp towel that I had. Once he was down, a few others jumped in, dousing him with water too, and asking what they should do. I told one of them to call 911, and I tried to get the guy's attention. He was groaning, in a lot of pain, but he was giving some answers and very short ones. I wasn't a doctor or anything of the sorts, but the main thing I could think to ask him was if he could breathe, and he responded yes. So, we were making progress, I guess. But the damage had already been done. A couple of times over, too. His face was red and blistered. His shirt was mostly burned away. Whatever it was made of burned really fast. His hair was also singed along his face. The smell was god-awful. The burning flesh and hair, not to mention body odors and beer all around. I wanted to gag and felt bad, but it was bad. It wouldn't have been so bad, but his eyes were wide open. His face was red and blistered, so I know that he saw me do it too, but after all of that, even with the amount of pain and fear that he was in, he reached his arm out, grabbed my arm, and said, "Hey, thank you." Finally, the paramedics arrived, and they immediately went to work on him. They loaded him up and whisked him away. And clearly, there were some problems with us continuing the show, so we sadly had to cut it, but the third band was pretty cool and apparently played a little acoustic set out in the parking lot while the rest of us cleaned the place up, checking for any residual fire hazards. That was probably one of the craziest things I'd witnessed during my time bartending there. The smell stuck with me, and the terrified look in his eyes really stuck with me. I had another crazy story from a different bar I worked at where two guys got into a fight, pulled out knives, and it became a literal bloody mess. And to add to the craziness of that whole situation, the two guys were friends. But maybe if I have time, I'll write that one up for you as well. Moral of the story? If you're going to drink, just leave the fire out of it, please. Hi, Raven. First of all, I want to thank you for reading out my story about my wife using a Ouija board. To be precise, doing Glasierrücken, as we call this thing in Germany. I really appreciate it. It made my day. Thank you for sending it in. I want to share another story with you about a childhood friend of mine. Again, I have to mention that I'm not a native speaker or writer, so I apologize in advance. As I mentioned in the previous story, I grew up in a small town in Germany that is surrounded by dense forest. You can only imagine what these woods have seen over the centuries. The Great Barrier between the Roman Empire and the Germanic barbarian tribes, the so-called limes, isn't far from there. So, it could be true that 2,000 years ago, Roman soldiers wandered through there, and then came the Middle Ages. The 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, World War II, and so on. This town I lived in is in a relatively old settlement that has probably been around for centuries. No one can tell for sure how old it is since there are no scriptures left from centuries ago, and our Germanic ancestors were illiterate. And since I grew up there were these rumors about a certain part of the forest. You can't quite narrow it down to a specific topic, but the overall narrative is that something is lurking in these woods. The story that I want to tell you must have taken place in the late 90s when my childhood friend and some other friends went camping in these woods. They were all familiar with the old wives' tales, so to say. Now, this probably doesn't mean much to you, but it actually tells you a lot about how far off the grid this town must be, if it's possible to just wander off into the woods, light a fire, and camp there, in a highly regulated country like Germany. In most other parts, it wouldn't take long before the police showed up, and this probably would be the case today. Anyhow, they were staying in these woods and did what teenagers and young adults do when they're all alone. And these things often circled around the consumption of alcohol and weed. And please keep in mind that in Germany, teenage alcoholism isn't considered a huge issue. Well, as they were partying, my friends got a bit drunk, but not like totally wasted. He had a good time listening to blasting music and partying with his friends until he felt the urge to pee. So he went up a small path on a hill that's maybe like 20 meters away from the fireplace. He crossed the tree line and went to an open field next to the woods, and suddenly stood in the awe-inspiring silence below a star-filled night sky. So it was the perfect place to pee, which he did. And right as he finished, in that very moment, he saw it. A completely black figure floating 2 meters above the ground with a glowing white face approaching him. At least, he described it that way. It had facial features, but not proportioned like a human being. The proportions were much bigger, with big black eye holes that were the darkest of dark you can imagine, almost as if you would look into the embodiment of nothing, if that makes sense. It came close to him, about 5 meters, not saying anything, but more like it wanted to present itself to my friend. And he, of course, was frozen in fear and was, in fact, as it later turned out, already in shock. It remained there for a few seconds until it flew away into the sky at a speed that he described as faster than anything humans have ever built. He remained there for a few moments until he could catch his breath again and was able to move. He stumbled back into the camp with a facial expression that made it instantly clear to anyone that he saw something atrocious. So they paused the music and turned to him. He was dizzy, mumbled, and stuttered, unable to build a sentence. Then soon afterwards he started shivering and was able to tell the others what he had just experienced. The way he did that made clear that he was not messing with them. Considering this whole thing, they should have brought him to the hospital, as he was obviously in shock. Instead, every single one of these strong, competent men decided that they would not stay at this place any longer. They packed up their stuff and left. When they brought my friend to his parents' house, he was still visibly shaking because, well, the shock. After that, he had trouble sleeping and going into the dark again, fearing that he would see that white face again. Over the years, things became normal again with him and the people around him. And soon the whole thing became sort of a joking matter for us boys, claiming that, insert his name here, I just saw someone's white behind or something like that. It's basic psychiatry. We laugh off what we can't explain. For whatever he saw that night, I highly doubt that it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But what was that thing that he saw in the night? Was it a ghost? Was it an entity that has lingered the Earth for aeons and has been forgotten in time? Was it something from another planet? Was it something that we humans don't even have the words to describe? Whatever it was, the white face was never seen again, and it remains a mystery what it's hiding behind the darkest eye holes that you could think of. Hi, Raven. I really enjoy listening to your stories, so I thought I would submit one of my own. Growing up, I lived in an odd-feeling house with my mom, dad, and brother. Things regularly went missing and turned up in odd places. Mostly, it just felt like you were being watched, but it was the overall heavy feeling of the place that lent to our belief that someone was there. However, there weren't very many concrete experiences to use as an example. Just weird vibes and some odd things going on. Well, one night it all changed suddenly. It was New Year's Eve sometime around mid-2000s. Well, technically New Year's Day since it was about 2 a.m. We had been to a small party with my immediate family and my brother's girlfriend. We returned home early. My dad and my brother had been arguing that night, so emotions were heightened. Everyone was already on edge, but no one had been drinking. My mom, my brother's girlfriend, and I were standing in the kitchen having a light-hearted discussion about the supernatural to break up the tension from earlier. My dad and brother were outside during this whole exchange. Anyways, eventually the discussion veered to our house in question. About how someone else was in the house, how we could feel him at times. The girlfriend said that she never had a supernatural experience, but was terrified of the idea of it happening. We admitted that things were quiet here, but we definitely weren't alone. She said, "Talking about this kind of freaks me out." And my mom and I both assured her it was okay. Nothing bad would happen. That the spirit just liked to hang around us, and then it happened. The kitchen's kind of circular, and there were 3 of us standing about 5 feet from one another in a triangle. On the counter, about 2 feet from me, An empty plastic bottle that was sitting about 6 inches from the edge of the counter suddenly fell off the counter. It didn't just flop onto the ground. No, it jumped and spiraled in the air like someone whacked it hard, and it flew onto the floor in between the three of us, as if the spirit was saying, "Haha, yeah, I'm here." We just looked at each other in shock. I asked them the typical, "You saw that, right?" The girlfriend just nodded, absolutely terrified, and my mom said, "Yep, guess he wanted us to see that." It was crazy. After years of feeling weird in the house, all of a sudden there was an overt experience with a witness as well. And no one else was in the house but the three of us. There was nothing else on the counter either, nor could someone have possibly orchestrated the bottle falling. It just flew off the counter on its own, right in the middle of our discussion about said ghost in the house. It was bizarre. Things don't fly off counters, but after years of living there and years of feeling like being watched, we finally had something happen to confirm these feelings. Anyway, as the years went on, things kept happening in the house, but as always, they were small, nearly inconsequential. But that heavy feeling of being watched continued. Things stopped going missing, thankfully. Honestly, at most times it felt okay. Like whomever was there wanted us to know for sure they were there, and that they were as used to us as we were of them. Most paranormal experiences seem to be intimidating or aggressive, but somehow, ours ended up just being like a pal. Like a roommate who never left and apparently only made themselves known to make a point at the most opportune moment. Anyway, thank you for letting me share my odd little experience. I've had this story that I have been wanting to talk about for a long time. It's the kind of thing that feels unbelievable, almost unreal, like it happened to someone else. I guess it did technically happen to someone else, but myself and my whole family were very much affected by the whole thing. It's hard to explain. Maybe the word surreal is what I'm looking for, but I'll do my best to just give you the information of what happened without letting my personal thoughts or emotions get in the way of me writing it. My older brother, Mark, was the kind of person that just didn't get angry. The entirety of his life, he was the most chill person ever. You could insult him to his face, call him names, yell or threaten him, and not once had I ever seen him lose his cool. He was 5 years older than me, and he was my rock. When I got my first car, which was an old hand-me-down from my uncle, he spent an entire weekend teaching me the basics of maintenance. He taught me how to check the oil, and check my tires, how to change the tires if I ever needed to, and where the jack goes to lift the car. All the basic things that, even though they're simple, a lot of people just don't really know. Another thing he taught me was how to not be an idiot on the road. He would always tell me things like, if someone gets on your tail and wants to pass you, just let them do it. It's not worth getting mad about or reacting to, because you never know what kind of crazy is behind that wheel. I think he lived by that rule. He was an incredibly patient driver. With that out of the way, I want to get on to the day that everything happened. I was about 17, which would put Mark at 22. He was working as a carpenter for a little local group working on a fairly major project that was about an hour and a half away from our parents' house. Because Mark was always a family-oriented person, and he didn't have a girlfriend or kids or anything like that, he liked to come home for the weekends when he could. He would spend time with our dad and with me when I was available. I wasn't too busy or anything. It was just that I had a part-time job at a sandwich shop, so when I wasn't at school, I was usually there. It was a Saturday. I know this because I had to work at noon, and I never worked on Sundays. Mark was home for that weekend, and I remember mentioning to him that my car had made a strange sound the day before, like a popping sound or something. He and I were talking about it, but I really couldn't get into it, so we came to an agreement. He would drive me to work in my car and then take it for a spin around town to see if he could replicate what it was doing. He was concerned that it was something that could become major, so he wanted to be the one driving it if something went wrong. I agreed. I trusted him to drive my car, no issues there. He drove me to my job. I told him I would be off at 5 if he could come pick me up, and he said that he would be there. Then, I watched him drive off. What I didn't realize is that this would be our last conversation. This would be the last time that I ever spoke to my brother, and I hate that our last conversation was what it was. The rest of the story, unfortunately, is from secondhand reports, so I can't tell you that every single bit of it is exactly how it happened, but I have to assume that it is accurate for the most part. These secondhand reports come from the police reports, and witnesses to the whole thing that happened, including my cousin who was actually nearby at the time. There was a stretch of road in town where 3 lanes merge down to 2, and the speed limit drops 5 miles per hour. It was always a nightmare because merging and slowing down at the same time seems to be one too many tasks for people on that road. Apparently, Mark was in the middle lane, and a guy in a big black SUV was driving in the right lane trying to get over. The driver of the SUV was a maniac, weaving left and then back to the lane that ended to pass people, and tailgating literally everyone he got behind. He was clearly in a hurry and was losing his mind to the slowdown of traffic. The next part is speculation to some extent, but I would guess that Mark, being Mark, saw the SUV coming and what he was doing, and slowed down a little bit to let the guy pass. Mark wasn't passive-aggressive, and he wouldn't have done anything to block this guy or intentionally piss him off, and he would have done anything he could to prevent an accident. It was reported that when the SUV passed in front of Mark, he slammed his brakes, hard. Mark was able to stop the car. He didn't hit him, thankfully. After this, the SUV driver just sat there. He stopped his car in front of Mark, unmoving in the middle lane of traffic that was already slowing everything down. It was like this for several moments until someone hit their horn for him to go. I don't know for sure that it was Mark, but what I've been told says that it was likely him that hit the horn, which is probable. Again, Mark wouldn't have laid on the horn or held it. He would have probably hit it once or twice, like, "Hey dude, move, please." At that point, it was reported that the SUV driver put his car in park, got out, and then started to walk back to where Mark was stopped a foot behind his SUV. Mark apparently rolled down the window and was just sitting there looking bewildered. The guy in the SUV was a huge dude, reported as being muscular, bald, and tattered up to the top of his head. He was screaming obscenities as he walked up to Mark's window, and Mark put his hands up and said, "Hey man, it's cool, let's just go." This maniac then grabbed the handle to the car and yanked the door open, and then started beating on Mark. He pulled him out of the car and, from what I was told, hit Mark's head against the door of my car multiple times. Then, when Mark fell to the ground, this guy kicked him in the face. The whole thing was over in a matter of seconds. Mark was lying on the ground unmoving, and the maniac just stood there for a moment and then walked back to his SUV and floored it. Just like that. The traffic started to flow around Mark and my car, and the only reason he didn't get run over was because a couple of other drivers had seen what happened and stopped to block the lane. A couple moments later, the paramedics were on the scene and Mark was rushed to the hospital. this is where I have to control myself and try to just state the facts, because it is quite hard for me. The damage that Mark sustained when the man hit his head against the car was bad enough, but it was likely the kick to the face that actually did the most damage. Mark suffered from a subdural hematoma and a major brain swell. The bones in his face were destroyed. His cheekbone and orbital socket on the right were shattered. The paramedics and the medical staff did everything they could to try to save him, but the end result was pretty much the worst outcome. Mark ended up in basically a vegetative state. There was literally nothing they could do to bring him back from it, and my parents had to make the call to take him off life support and let him go. Having to make that decision almost makes it worse. If the man had killed him, it would have been out of their hands. But instead, that monster left him teetering on the edge of life with no way to climb back up. The worst part of all this, the one thing that kills me inside every time I think about it, is that they never caught the guy. He had a faded temporary tag on his SUV that no one could remember or read. There was no security footage of it happening, since this was before cameras and dash cams were everywhere, and the guy just vanished. It's entirely possible that he was just passing through our town on the way to his destination, and he and my brother ended up in the same place at the wrong time. My family was devastated, completely ruined, because this psycho got mad at traffic and mad at my brother for hitting his horn. The life my brother had, the promise he showed, was all ripped away so some lunatic could get his anger out. And then he got to go on and live his life normally. I have to assume that he's probably in prison for something else. No one crazy enough to commit murder in the middle of the street like that would stay free for too long. And I have to keep that assumption in my mind because it's one of the only things that keeps me going. Even if it's just pretend, I want to believe that my brother's killer is in prison for something else and that he will rot there. Mark lost his life way too young, over something so petty and pointless, all over a single act of road rage. I will always miss him, and I keep this idea of you never know what kind of crazy is behind that wheel in the back of my mind every time I decide to drive somewhere, because it was that same crazy that took him from me. Dear As the Raven Dreams, this is a true horror story that involves child abuse and very adult situations. So please note that this story is really for people 18 years and over. If listeners do not want to listen to a story like this, we suggest they skip over this one. Thank you. Consider that your content or trigger warning for this story, child abuse and adult situations, and from what I've read, some situations of violence as well. So, just a note. My name is Carolyn, and I will not use anybody's real last name in my story for privacy reasons, except Father Flanagan, who was the pastor of my church. The story all happened in a small town of West Virginia when I was 10 years old in 1972. In 1972, Richard Nixon was the 37th President of the United States, with Spiro Agnew as his vice president. My father was a businessman in West Virginia, and he made a good living for my mother and I. I was the only child and had no siblings. My father was into coal and energy sources in West Virginia, which still had a good coal industry in the 1970s that still exists today. But today it can't be just coal. It has to be other energy sources too. The West Virginia coal mines in Appalachia were just up the mountains from where we lived. You could smell the coal in the air, especially when it was breezy. I loved living in West Virginia. We had a good sense of community, and I had a lot of friends to play with. On Sunday, my family, along with many other families, went to church where Father Homer Flanagan was the pastor. Father Flanagan was a nice and calm-speaking man who looked 100 years old to me at the time, because I was only a child, but was 50 years old in real life. He was around 6 foot tall with a bald head, wearing round glasses on a thin build. Under Father Flanagan, we enjoyed church functions like annual summer picnics, church donations for the needy, and outside baptisms. I especially enjoyed the church picnic where I played with friends, and there was an abundance of good food to eat. Father Flanagan even took some kids up a ride in his back of his old Model T pickup truck on these functions, putting hay in the back of the truck, making it more fun. Father Flanagan was a widower. His wife died a few years before. His home was right behind the church, which was a nice, brown-in-color, country-style home built in the 1920s, with a white picket fence surrounding the property, and a nicely mowed lawn. He also had well-manicured bushes and a nice garden. Father Flanagan sometimes invited my family for supper on Sundays, where we would have chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, rice, gravy, corn on the cob with lemonade on the side. He often made a delicious dessert of pumpkin pie, lemon pie, apple pie, or chocolate cake waiting for us after our meal. Father Flanagan was a good cook. I also liked all the old photographs he had around the house of his parents and grandparents. I especially liked the big picture of him and his wife, with his wife sitting outside of their home on a chair, and him standing proudly beside her. Both dressed in their Sunday best. The picture must have been taken in the 1940s when he and his wife were very young. And next to the big picture, sitting on the table, was an old Vitaphone record player that still played records. Remember that this was the early 70s, before the computer age, so no computer, cell phones, or answering machines at this time. All was going well in my life in West Virginia, until it didn't. It all started innocently enough when Father Flanagan saw me playing outside alone one weekend, and asked me if I would like to help him with his garden since I liked gardens so much. I readily agreed. I did love beautiful gardens, and I loved to help my mother do hers often. Father Flanagan's garden was indeed beautiful. It had beautiful insects, like a couple of monarch butterflies and bumblebees flying around them. After I finished helping Father Flanagan in his garden, he asked me if I wanted to come inside his house for a little dessert treat before I went home. I readily agreed. I knew Father Flanagan was a great cook like my mom and had something good for me to eat inside of his house. At first, though, I washed my hands before I sat down in anticipation on what he was going to serve me. It almost felt like the female version of Charlie of the Chocolate Factory, because there were so many good homemade things to eat at Father Flanagan's house. But would unfortunately find out soon that appearances can be deceiving, even deadly. When I sat down in the chair, I spotted a delicious-looking pecan pie, but it only had 2 pieces of it left, so I thought, better let Father Flanagan finish it. I also saw some very tasty-looking chocolate chip oatmeal cookies in a glass-covered plate. Behave, Carolyn. Don't be too greedy for the scrumptious delights, I thought secretly to myself. As I looked at Father Flanagan in anticipation on what he would serve me, he then said, "How about a nice ice cream cone, little missy? It's hot and you look like you could use one." He said this to me with a smile. This was in the month of May, and the day was hot. "That sounds great," I replied, gushing excitedly. "What flavors do you have?" "Well, let's see. Vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry," he replied, beaming at me. "I'll have chocolate. That's my favorite." Father Flanagan looked at me happily as he began making my ice cream quickly. "Coming right up," he replied. When Father Flanagan gave me my ice cream cone, he had put an assortment of ice cream sprinkles on it that I loved as I started to eat it. When I was eating the ice cream, Father Flanagan surprised and embarrassed me in telling me what a pretty little girl he thought I was. He loved my golden mane of hair and ocean blue eyes. He also went on to say that my body had blossomed very well for my age group, much more so than the other girls in church, and that he also liked all the pretty dresses that I wore. I looked up at Father Flanagan, smiling at first, trying to be polite, when my focus all of a sudden started to get blurry, and my head started to spin. I felt a bit sick to my stomach. The chocolate ice cream still tasted delicious, but yet, underneath it all, it had a sour taste. Father Flanagan must have put something in it, must have spiked it, I thought to myself. And I suddenly passed out right at the table. The next time I woke up, I was in a nice pink little girl's bedroom, under the covers, with no clothes on, with a big teddy bear and a big doll on the bed beside me. On the table next to the bed, there was a toy pink phone. There was also a big swing hanging from the ceiling, even a carnival-like mini popcorn machine maker. The room looked like a child's fantasy room. I then looked up at Father Flanagan, himself smiling and standing over me. "Where am I?" I said to him, startled. Father Flanagan told me I was in a bedroom that he had made just for me to play and sleep when I came to visit him. He assured me that there was no need to be afraid and that he was just washing my clothes in the laundry that were dirty from gardening, and that I would get them back soon. He also told me that he called my parents about all this. "I put you in bed because you needed a little sleep is all. You still look tired from gardening. I'll turn off the lights for a few more hours so you can sleep, and then I'll bring you back your clothes and you can leave," he said to me, smiling. I nodded my head weakly. I was still tired and needed more sleep, but it did seem like something funny was in that chocolate ice cream that he had served me to cause me to be like this. Father Flanagan turned off the lights and left the room. But 2 minutes later, I heard the door creak open again and was surprised and shocked that Father Flanagan started getting into bed next to me. And even more shocked that he was naked, with himself fully there. It was darkened in the room, but I could still see well enough. "Carolyn, you're such a pretty girl. I've had my eyes on you for quite a while now. After tonight, you won't be a girl, but a woman," he said seriously. "You might want to hold your teddy bear doll tight for a moment. It'll only hurt for a minute," he said. As soon as he said this, I hugged my big teddy bear tight and gritted my teeth as, well, you know what happened next. And you know how severe this was, as I was still a child. But I didn't know all this at the time. After this, Father Flanagan cleaned me up as I went back to sleep. After a few hours, Father Flanagan came back with my clothes. While I was putting them back on, he had me do a pinky promise that I would never tell my parents what had happened here. He also told me that this playroom was mine, and I could come any time to play there when I wanted to. I nodded my head and started to smile, since the child's bedroom and playroom did look inviting, and it did seem like something I'd want to come and play in. As a child, I did what Father Flanagan promised, and I didn't tell my parents about the assault. I was a child and I didn't know any better. Like I said before, the playroom looked so inviting with the swing and the stuffed teddy bears and dolls. I actually did go back. Father Flanagan often took photos of me with his camera playing with the teddy bears, the dolls, on the swing and phone, and he even got me to pose without clothes for him on occasion too. He kept telling me that I was so grown up now, so this wouldn't be a problem anymore if I posed for him like this from time to time. He also got me some new toys in various colors of pretty dresses, including a sailor suit dress that I loved. How could a little girl say no to all this? As I posed in the child bedroom and playroom in front of a big mirror in the clothes he bought for me, and all of this I see now was just more candy to keep me as his little plaything in his secret bedroom. This is all very sad looking back at it. I was just a scared little 10-year-old girl trying way too hard to be an adult for an adult man that was far too old for me. This was child endangerment. It was against the law for me as a child to be with an adult man like this in the first place. But again, I didn't really know any better then. There was one thing that I discovered under the rug by accident when I was playing alone in the bedroom for a while. Under the rug was a medium-sized hatch, a floor doorway. I knew the father would leave me alone to play for at least 30 more minutes, so I decided to go through this hatch and down the darkened steps. And when I turned on the lights, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. There were old photographs on a table of little girls my age from probably the early 40s to 1972. And the last photo was myself, Carolyn, smiling that he took of me recently and framed. I felt like screaming in absolute terror and shock when I saw this. What's more, above the smiling child table photos were undressed females posing sexually. No doubt for Father Flanagan. Some photos were in black and white and some were in color. The oldest ones went back to the early 1940s, and that wasn't all that I saw. On the side of the table, there were some old and crinkly newspaper articles of some girls found dead and strangled in the woods of West Virginia, nude, with their bodies violated. Articles again from the 1940s to the 1970s. I took a moment to look at all the pictures and the old articles of the girls, and a big chill went up my spine. Again, I felt like screaming my lungs out, but I held it all inside. My thoughts about Father Flanagan were correct. Father Flanagan was a pedo. And now I was finding out, a murderer for years also. I surely was not the only female child that the pastor had assaulted in this small West Virginia town. He'd obviously done this for many, many years now, and had never been caught. Never been discovered, maybe. Possibly his deceased wife may have known, but didn't let in on the church community since this was a close and tight-knit West Virginia small town. And often back then, good church-going ladies often kept their mouths shut, especially with matters involving men. Many small towns do have their terrible secrets. Maybe quiet whispers scattered about by some townspeople, but most kept their mouths shut. After seeing all this, and after the assaults, despite enjoying my big bedroom playroom, I'd had enough. I had to tell my parents about the evils of Father Flanagan, and quickly before I threw up all over the floor in disgust. This was truly frightening and sickening, especially for a young child such as I at the time. I had just made it up the old stairs, closed the floor door, and put the rug over it just in time before Flanagan came through the door. He didn't even knock, just came in smiling devilishly. At first I thought he might violate me again, but he said it was time for me to go home, or my parents would ask a lot of questions on where I was. He offered me a ride home, but I decided to walk home since it was close enough, with walking distance away. On my way home, though walking down a path, I stopped to sit down and I cried. I had to let it all out. One of my male friends, whose name was Timmy, was a few years older than I was. He was in 8th grade. He was a well-built and muscular kid, and he saw me crying and sat down next to me as I told him what had happened. Timmy was a nice guy, but he did have a bit of a temper that showed itself sometimes. But he was also the sort of guy who would fight for you if you were his friend. He always had your back. Timmy told me to go home and that he would take care of everything, because his father was a policeman. Looking back at this, I should have told my parents first. Making it worse, I let my friend Timmy, who was a kid himself, try to handle a huge problem such as this. When I got home, I told my parents everything that had happened, and Timmy's father, who was a policeman, would handle the matter. The bad thing that happened, though, 2 days later, I heard that Father Flanagan was actually found dead in his own bed with his neck broken. His eyes and mouth were wide open. My father asked questions around town on what happened to the pastor and who killed him, since Timmy and his dad couldn't be found at the time. One townsperson told him that it was Timmy, my friend, who had murdered Father Flanagan and broke his neck with his strong bare hands because of what had happened to me and the other girls that Flanagan had abused and murdered. Timmy's father was a policeman who protected him for being prosecuted for murder, and the whole thing was eventually pushed under the rug. No prosecution or prison time at all for Timmy. Nothing. My family and a few townspeople were the only ones who ever knew about who killed Father Flanagan. In fact, most of the townspeople thought that the murderer might have been a hobo from a train, or someone asking Father Flanagan for money, and they broke into his home and killed him, because Father Flanagan was hesitant to let them in. Once again, most townsfolk did not even know it was their own townsfolk Timmy who did it, because Timmy was nice to everybody. The type of kid to cut your grass in the spring and summer and shovel your snow in winter or paint your fence for you. Nobody would have suspected that he was ever part of any murder, but tragically he was. Timmy and his father, the policeman, just acted regular around town like it was tragic, that they were not part of Father Flanagan's death. About a year later, I guess to further protect his son, Timmy's family moved out of West Virginia for parts unknown, and I never saw Timmy again. I did want Timmy's help, but not like that. Timmy's temper caused him to make rash decisions. He didn't even tell his dad, the cop, that Flanagan was a pedo and a murderer until Timmy had already taken him out. I wish that Timmy hadn't lost his head and decided to kill Father Flanagan himself. Just have his dad arrest Flanagan and let the courts deal with it. I think Timmy's dad probably wished this also. I think Timmy decided to murder him knowing his father's being a cop would protect him from going to prison, and he was right. Especially in small-town West Virginia such as this. I guess Timmy wrongly thought that it was right to take matters into his own hands and do away with Father Flanagan himself in a small-town justice kind of thing. One thing that I was happy about, though, Flanagan could no longer harm or murder a little kid again. This all happened a long time ago, in a small town in West Virginia. As for me, I'm now a happy grandmother, and I no longer live in that small town, West Virginia. And thank you for listening to my story. I was 14 years old when my mom finally left my dad. He was physically and emotionally abusive to both of us, but my mom took most of the attacks. My dad didn't target me until I got a little older and a little more of a voice. He had a strong opinion about me, a stupid young girl trying to tell him, a grown man, what to do. I tried to bite my tongue, knowing my mom would usually pay for it, but I started getting to the point that I couldn't hold back. Thankfully, my aunt finally talked some courage into my mom after he broke her arm and we moved out. We packed up our stuff, everything we could take that day, and with my aunt and uncle's help, we loaded up their truck and van and left. My mom filed a protective order, and for once, we could finally breathe. We stayed at my aunt and uncle's for a few months until my mom found a nice home for rent for just the two of us. Apparently, she had already looked at a few places, not entirely sure this would work, but then my dad found out, which caused the fight where he broke her arm. Anyway, we moved into our new little home, which was definitely smaller than our old one, but it was perfect for us. It was a 2-bedroom, 1 bath, but was pretty up to date. The owner, or landlord, did a great job at keeping up with it, which was nice. We even met some of our neighbors, including the next door neighbor, Lee. He was about my mom's age, and he came over and helped us when my uncle brought over a couch my mom had bought. My mom was no longer wearing a cast, but she did still have a sling, so My uncle was trying to get it himself. Lee was very nice and introduced himself afterwards. He explained that he lived alone, never married, no kids. He seemed like a nice guy. We went about our normal life, or at least trying to make things as normal as possible. My mom continued to work, but I was going to be in a new school district, which was fine. I still had my close friends from my previous school that I kept in touch with by phone and email. I did have my own bedroom that my mom let me decorate however I wanted, and I loved that. I loved that home for us. We could relax there. We could come home, have dinner, talk about our days, and not ever have to worry about doing something wrong. Even our neighbors talked to us, which was a nice change. But I started to notice something that was a little strange, but I didn't know what to do with it. The houses in our neighborhood are all pretty close to each other, so when I'm walking up our driveway, I could hear Lee's TV, or hear him, talking inside if he had a window open. My room was also on the ground floor, facing out to our driveway. I liked it because when I'm in my room, I can tell when my mom got home. Sometimes I could also see Lee in his window upstairs from my room. If his house was set up like ours, I say this because they looked identical on the outside. The upstairs was a loft with a walk-in closet, so he would either be in a room or in a closet. I would glance up when I saw movement in the side of my vision, and would just see him walking by the window. But there were a few nights that I would wake up and roll over, and maybe drink some water, and I would look out my window to see a figure in his window. Like he was just standing there, watching. The first time, I thought it was weird, but quickly fell back asleep. But then I saw him doing this a few more times. One time, I covered myself way up and cracked my eyes open just a sliver and watched him as he stared out the window. I couldn't tell since it was dark where he was looking, but the idea of him looking into my window kind of bothered me. So I closed my curtain. I didn't want to shut it because I liked the night breeze and listening to the crickets chirp. When I went to bed, I just remembered to keep my curtains closed. Then, I would see him during the day, and he was always the same kind and funny man. He asked me about school when I got off the bus. There were a few times that he even told me my mom would be right back, saying that she had to run an errand, and I thanked him. I just figured he was being friendly with my mom. She had told him where she was going, and he was passing it along. I didn't get any weird vibes from him when I saw him in person. He was always so gentle and soft-spoken, but I was just weirded out by his nightly routine. Why would he be standing by the window, possibly watching me? This went on for months. He was fine during the day. He even came over a few times, helping my mom with car issues or with our toilet one time. My mom even invited him over for dinner once, and he grilled for us. But I couldn't get over the weird watching he did at night. I wanted to ask about it, but I also felt like maybe I was being irrational. It was his home. I was a kid still, and maybe there was some other reason for it. Maybe he wasn't watching me, but was just looking out the window. So I never mentioned it. Maybe part of the reason was knowing how my dad would have reacted if I said something like that, making fun of me and such, even though my mom was never like that. He may have been gone, but that trauma remained. I just did my best to put it out of my mind, knowing that during the day, Lee was a nice guy, and I just kept my curtains closed at night. After a few months there, I had an extended weekend due to a holiday giving us Monday off. After talking with my mom about what I wanted to do for the weekend, she agreed to let me have a friend over, and I invited my friend from my old school, Paige. She'd been my BFF for as long as I could remember, and we only saw each other once since we moved. Before, I would always go to her house, not wanting her around my dad. She knew all about him, and I didn't want to risk him attacking her, too. Now, I wanted her to be able to go to our home and spend all night in my room doing whatever we wanted. The first time she came over, we were still unpacking and getting settled in. Now we were done and could relax the whole time. To make it even better, my mom said that she was invited to a friend's house on Saturday night, but wanted to make sure that we would be okay without her. At the age of 14, we were more than happy to have the house to ourselves. She said that she would be close in case we needed anything, and even helped order pizza for us, leaving us cash for the tip when they arrived, and then she left. So, there we were, Paige and I alone with no adults, with the freedom to do whatever we wanted that whole night. Not that my mom was ever a problem. Especially after moving, she gave me a lot of freedom, and she treated me as an equal. But it was fun having full reign of the place. We ate, we tried to make makeshift ice cream by freezing chocolate milk, and then watched whatever we could find on TV. Later that night, we went to my room wanting to do something crafty, so I pulled out my coloring supplies and we lied on my floor drawing and coloring and talking. She told me how school was going and about the people and teachers that I knew, and I told her about my new school. While we were coloring, there was a big breeze that made my curtain move a bit, and it reminded me that the window was still completely open. I got up to close the window and was relieved to see that Lee was not sitting by the window. Paige asked me why I closed it since it felt nice out, and I finally told her about Lee. She agreed with me that it was definitely creepy, and she suggested that I tell my mom about it. She explained that she should know in case it escalated or in case he was just faking it during the day. She made good points, and I promised her that I would tell her after she left. But then I also mentioned that, unlike most nights, he was not by the window. Paige joked that it was because she was over there, and we just left it at that. And I was thankful that he took the night off when I had my friend over. We continued on with our night until I started hearing a crunching sound by my window. Leaves had started falling, so I assumed that's what I was hearing. But then I had to remember that in order for that sound to happen, someone had to be walking across them. I stopped doing what I was doing and just looked up at my window, and Paige noticed too. She asked me what was wrong, and I told her what I heard. We both listened for a moment as we started hearing it again. She looked at me and whispered, "Where's that coming from?" I didn't want to answer her because it sounded like it was right outside my window. That is when I really started to panic. Lee wasn't at his window, and we were now hearing someone at my window. And we were home alone. 2 15-year-old girls. I made a comment out loud to Paige saying that we should go get a snack, trying to get her to follow along, and she agreed and we went to the kitchen. She asked what we should do, and I grabbed the home phone saying that I needed to call my mom. I called her cell phone, and she quickly answered, and I explained to her that someone was walking around our home. She asked me to explain, and I just unloaded on her. I told her about the crunching I was hearing, how I kept seeing Lee at the window, and how I thought it must have been him and how creepy it was. She said something to someone in the background while I explained all this to her. She was telling me to call the police and that she was on her way. As I was hanging up, I heard her say something and assumed it was to me, but I'd already hung up. I picked the phone back up and remembered staring at it for a moment, debating on if I should call her back or just call 911. Paige also asked me what we should do. I started dialing my mom's number again when I heard shouting coming from the front of the house. It was clearly 2 male voices. Then I heard grunts and a lot of shuffling. I was scared, but I also wanted to know what they looked like and if it was Lee, so I went to the front door and, I know, stupidly, opened the first door. We had the main door and a screen door, both of which were locked. I opened the main door, and to my surprise, Lee was standing holding a baseball bat, ready to swing at the man sitting on the porch with his hands up. The guy sitting on the porch was my dad. I remember just standing by the door, terrified and frozen in place. Paige had only seen my dad once and never Lee, so I don't think she recognized either of them. She screamed at me to close the door, which I did, locking it immediately. Her screaming was enough to snap me out of my stupor, and I called the cops. We both ran to my room where I locked my door and window while I remained on the phone with the operator. We were both terrified at that point in the night, but slowly I became confused, and then accepting. The police finally showed up, and I didn't come out until I heard my mom's voice at the door. The police then talked to all of us, and I explained what I had seen on previous nights, while my mom had a strange look on her face. Almost like embarrassment and sadness. I told them I didn't see who was at my window that night, however, and after a lot of talking, a cop left with my dad in the back, a sight that I'd seen too many times before, and I was surprised to see Lee hugging my mom and her hugging him back. And that's when my mom finally explained it to me. She'd been seeing Lee for almost 3 months at that point. She had told him all about my dad and how he threatened to, well, end us, if we ever left him. And this is why she wanted to move out of the city and out of the school district so he was less likely to find us. After telling him this, he became protective over both of us. Him looking out the window was him watching the front of the house. He wasn't even looking at my window. He was just as worried for our safety as my mom was. He would watch some nights, a lot of nights, to make sure that no one, or someone in particular, tried to break in. The night that we were home alone, my mom had gone to his place, just next door. I had no idea because I didn't watch her leave. His driveway was on the other side of his house, too, so I wouldn't have seen her only go to his place. I guess she did that instead of walking to make it look like she left. They'd been watching a movie in his living room, which is why he wasn't at his window when I called her. Lee heard what I said, got up and put his shoes on and grabbed the bat. My mom was asking him something when I had hung up, which is what I heard. Lee immediately went out his back door so the person didn't see him and snuck around our home to find the guy. He spotted the man at the front door trying to open it, and that's when he started yelling at him. He swung the bat at the back of his knees, making him fall, and they started yelling at each other. My mom was in the yard when I opened the door, but I hadn't seen her. From my room, I couldn't hear them talking, but my mom realized that it was my dad, and they started arguing. Thankfully, the police showed up soon after, putting my dad in the back, and my mom came in to get us. She wasn't ready to tell me about her and Lee yet, not knowing how to tell me. Even though my dad was not a good person, she felt bad, thinking that it may have been too soon for her to be dating again. But Lee was a great guy through and through. I thought that he was creepy, and while it was a little strange, I understood. He was trying to be the protector of both of us, knowing what we had gone through, and I kind of felt bad, telling my mom all that I did on the phone. My dad was obviously arrested and charged with a few things. I think trespassing, violating the restraining order, and carrying a weapon with intent to harm. He apparently had a hammer on him. I don't like to think about what his intentions were that night, and no one seems to know how he found out where we lived. Thankfully, we never saw my dad after that, and Lee actually became a permanent part of our lives. No longer was it a secret. He came over for dinner more often than not, and even stayed over quite often. We joked about Lee watching us now, but he also apologized for scaring me prior, saying that he probably should have been more subtle about it. My mom and Lee actually got married. I learned Lee was previously married and divorced too, but his was much more amicable. Lee turned out to be a great guy, and an even better father figure than I could have asked for. But those few months in the beginning, it was pretty scary for me. Already cautious about men, thanks to my dad, I was expecting him to be a problem. But, as it turns out, I had tunnel vision, and I didn't realize how much of a blessing he would become and protect me from the real danger. In August of 1969, the music festival Woodstock went off wonderfully. It went so well, in fact, that the Grateful Dead decided to do a concert on the West Coast that would be free for all to attend. This all sounds wonderful. One of the most popular bands of the 60s with a star-studded cast of people slated to perform, including Santana, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and the Rolling Stones. With all these stars and with tremendous fanfare, the show was well on its way to being organized and ready to kick off on December 6th of 1969. However, what was meant to be a celebration of that free love spirit of the time would turn into something that is still remembered. Just not for the reasons people would have liked for it to have been remembered. The plan was to host the concert at Altamont Speedway in Livermore, California, and there were little worries about the venue or being able to accommodate what was expected to be an absolutely humongous crowd. The one pressing issue, though, that had not been addressed was security. The Grateful Dead and the group Jefferson Airplane suggested to the Rolling Stones management that they should book the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club for security for the gig, as they had used them in the past and had no incidents. And thus, the Hells Angels were booked as security for $500 worth of beer. But this would be quite a fateful decision. But then again, I have a lot of hindsight here to say something like that. There is a lot of dispute over just what role the Hells Angels were meant to play at that concert. Sonny Barger himself has said that there was no agreement for them to be security of any kind, that he and his, quote, boys were invited to drink beer and enjoy the show until it was over. Other accounts say that they were just meant to keep people from rushing the stage. Others claim they don't even know why the Angels were there to begin with. The show began with Santana performing, a set that was fairly uneventful. However, as the day dragged on, more people were getting high and drunk and inevitably getting more restless as they enjoyed their respective buzzes. The Angels and the crowd were getting more irritable, and violence was beginning to break out, as stoned hippies began trying to climb onto the stage and the Angels were beating people up and throwing them off the stage back into the crowd. Things began to escalate as the Angels began to arm themselves with sawn-off pool cues and bike chains. When someone from the crowd knocked over one of the Angels' bikes, things really started to get heated. The Angels got even rougher with the crowd, and even started to get more aggressive with the performers. Marty Balin of the group Jefferson Airplane jumped off of the stage during their set to try to sort out whatever the issue was, only to be knocked unconscious by one of the Hells Angels. Paul Cantor, the guitarist for the group, sarcastically thanked the Angels for knocking out their singer, which provoked Angel Bill Freach, who grabbed one of the microphones and began to yell and argue with the musician about the incident. The Grateful Dead, the primary organizer of the event, were supposed to be playing in between the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young and the Rolling Stones. But once they heard about the situation with Balin, they refused to play a set and left the venue. When Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young took the stage, things did nothing but further deteriorate when Stephen Stills was stabbed in the leg by a Hells Angels with a sharpened bicycle spoke. By the time the Rolling Stones came out to play, it was utter chaos. The Angels were fighting the crowd was fighting amongst themselves. It was just an incredibly violent ordeal at this point, and just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, it of course does. A member of the crowd, a young man named Meredith Hunter, aged 18, had attempted to climb onto the stage with other concert-goers, only to be punched by an angel and tossed back into the crowd. Meredith was reportedly so high he could barely stand, but he was angry, and out of his mind on drugs, and he came to the front of the crowd, right at the foot of the stage, and drew a gun. Reportedly, he was pointing it at Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones. And that's when Hell's Angels' Paul Pissarro leapt into action, allegedly pulling a knife from, some say his belt, others say his boot. The knife was tucked into his sock. Once armed, he rushed Hunter and knocked the pistol away with his left hand, and then stabbed Hunter twice in the head with his right hand, killing the young man. In the documentary, Gimme Shelter, it is revealed that Eric Sarin was on the stage recording and taking pictures of the crowd. And Sarin was unaware at first that he had caught the killing on film until a week later, when the raw footage was screened. The entire sequence is roughly 2 seconds long, and you can see the crowd part, and then Hunter appears front and center in his bright green suit, with the silhouette of a revolver clearly in his hand, visible against the light-colored vest of the person next to him. Pissarro comes in from the right and parries the gun and then stabs Hunter twice, then pulls him off screen. Later on, it's reported he stabbed Hunter 5 times in the upper back, and once he was on the ground, several other angels began to stomp on and kick him. The autopsy did confirm that Hunter was high on amphetamines at the time of his death. In 1971, Pissarro was charged with murder and taken to trial. After watching the footage shot at the concert, it was ruled self-defense, and Pissarro was found not guilty, acquitted of all charges. This was not the only violence that occurred over the course of the day and into the evening. All told, there was the killing of Meredith Hunter, 3 additional accidental deaths, numerous assaults occurred between members of the crowd that began turning on itself at a certain point. Multiple cars were stolen and abandoned, and there was also massive property damage that occurred during the chaos. All told, the concert that was meant to spread the love carried over from Woodstock instead became a violent riot that saw multiple people lose their lives, and so many more injured. I guess the only question that remains is, was this concert always doomed to be a tragedy, albeit of a different kind? Or was it the presence of the most notorious biker club in the world that set things on the disastrous course they ultimately went on? That, we will never have a true answer to. But we are all, of course, allowed to speculate on it. A while back, I gave you my story about a girl in high school that nobody seems to remember but me. You used the story in one of your postings on YouTube, so I thank you for that. There's something else about me that I would like to share with you. I'm 52 years old now, soon to be 53. I'm too old to care what people think about me, so I'll be honest about this, as I have kept these experiences very secret in my life. Until now. I haven't even spoke about much of this to my closest friend. I have the ability to sense energy both from the living and the dead. I can tell whether I'm going to like a person or not immediately as soon as I meet them, simply because of the energy they give off. This ability seems to affect my mother's side of the family. My mother's twin sister wrote a letter to my mother when I was a child, admitting to her that she could see dead people around her. People that were deceased. It all started when my aunt was a little girl. She said when she came home from school, she looked on the roof of her house and saw a man standing on the roof. She asked the man, "What are you doing on the roof of my house?" The man folded his arm and said something to her telepathically and then vanished. That ability seemed to have skipped my mother and hit me. Although my ability is not as strong as my aunt's was, as I cannot see spirits. But I can tell when they're around. It started on me when I was 7 years old. I was at my grandparents' house on Christmas Day. We opened up presents, and my grandparents were preparing Christmas dinner. Being the 7-year-old child that I am at that time, I told my dad that I was going upstairs to use the bathroom. When I went upstairs, after using the restroom, I went to open the bathroom door. I got the door open no more than a quarter of the way when the door slammed right in my face. I tried to open the door, but there was a disembodied female voice on the other side. She kept saying to me, No, Tim. No, Tim. Finally, I screamed so loud for help that somebody came upstairs and I was able to open the door. I ran out asking who was that woman behind the door. She wouldn't let me out. But my relatives insisted that there was nobody upstairs. I didn't know what to think about it. My grandparents lived in the sheet and tube company homes in Campbell, Ohio at the time. Those company homes were built in a very early 1900s. Some of them have been torn down, but there's still a few of them left, and they're over 100 years old. The people that still live in them have told me that they have experienced things in those places that cannot easily be explained. Finally, the last incident that happened to me, I'll explain to you. Fast forward to when I was 14 years old. Then, I was living on the east side of Youngstown, Ohio, at the time, near Lincoln Park. Unfortunately, the only other guy to verify this story no longer lives around me, as him and his family moved to Arizona when I was 14 years old. This friend was named Joey, and he had a sister named Diana. So if Joey happened to hear this story on YouTube, that I haven't seen him since I was 14, I would just like to say hello to him. The story that he would be able to verify is as follows. It was a summer day and me and Joey were down at Lincoln Park swinging on the swings, talking about kid stuff and minding our own business. All of a sudden, a very terrible negative energy came over me, to the point that I got sick to my stomach and wanted to vomit. I told Joey I didn't feel good and wanted to go home. He told me that he didn't feel good either. It's strange that we both felt the same thing at the same time. There's a set of steps just behind the security park office that leads up out of the park. The closer I got to that steps, the sicker I got to my stomach. I tried to drink a sip of water from the water fountain, but I just spit it right back up, as did Joey. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a disembodied voice that said, "Get out of here." I asked Joey if he heard that. Instead, he told me that he thought he heard someone say, "Quiet, I want to get them." I whispered to Joey, "Let's get out of here," and run through the woods out of the park. We ran through the woods up to the back road out of the park that led up to the 422 highway in Youngstown, Ohio. As we went over the bridge, which is above Lincoln Park, my stomach started to calm down and I felt better. But here's the scary part. Right after we got to the other side of the bridge, on the left-hand side, there's a fire station there. As we walked past it, a station wagon pulled up alongside us, and the guy inside the car said, "You smart-ass kids, I'll get you next time." Me and Joey looked at each other and we couldn't believe what we had just heard. That guy was trying to kidnap both of us. We went home and told our parents about it, but I don't remember if they ever called the police or not. I don't know where that disembodied voice came from, but it saved my life, and Joey's as well. Throughout my life, I've had many other experiences with spirits, but I won't go into those right now. But these experiences have affected me throughout my life. As a Christian, I do believe that there are both good spirits and evil spirits around us all the time. And the kind of person we are in ourselves is what we invite around us. Because of that, I choose to love people as much as I can, to bring about the positive things around me. Hi, Raven. I'm a 31-year-old woman, and I've been listening to you for a long time. What I appreciate most is how calm and unbiased your storytelling is. You let the stories breathe and speak for themselves. Thank you, I do my best. I heard you were asking for road rage stories, and I figured that now was the perfect time to share mine. For a little background, a lot of people change once they get behind the wheel. I know, because I was one of them. My husband and I loved driving fast cars, and we can tell when someone wants to, quote, play. For years, I carried that edge of aggression with me on the road. About 30 months ago, though, I quit drinking. Partly because we wanted to try for another child, partly because I was tired of the haze. Quitting cleared my mind, but it also made me emotional. Behind the wheel, that volatility came out. I worked hard since then to manage it, and I still drive assertively, but the true rage is gone. I say all of this because I understand road anger. Anger usually comes from fear. When someone cuts you off, it scares you, and that fear morphs into rage. But nothing in my past prepared me for what happened that day. My two sons, E, who was 8, and N, who was just over 2, were with me on the way back from my first appointment with a new trauma therapist. My mom had been too sick to babysit, so I had no choice but to bring them with me. The appointment was in the city, about an hour from where we live now. The streets there aren't confusing, but they're busy. The main road runs straight with traffic lights, and side streets feed into it with stop signs. I was at one of those side streets waiting at a stop sign to cross the main road. Parallel to me, another side street also ended in a stop. I watched a car pause there, wait its turn, and then make the turn correctly. But the next vehicle, a beat-up van, literally held together with bungee cords and duct tape, did not stop. It came flying around the corner and cut straight across. I started to cross when the road was clear, but the van nearly clipped me. My car's emergency braking kicked in. I laid on the horn, furious. The van finally stopped dead center as if daring me. This was now a quiet, narrow neighborhood road. 2 lanes. No traffic in the opposite direction. So I went around the van. I had barely gone 5 feet when I realized that they were right on my tail. So close that I could see the woman driving clear as day. I slowed, scanning for somewhere to pull off, figuring I could let them pass and maybe get their plate. But the moment that I edged toward the shoulder, the passenger door of that van flew open. A man jumped out and sprinted toward my car. Everything in me froze. I never put the car in park. Instinct told me that I might need to run someone over or take off. For context, my 2-year-old N was strapped rear-facing in his seat behind the passenger side. He was born premature, under 2 pounds, so I kept him in the rear-facing as long as possible. My stepson E sat quietly behind me on the driver's side. The man was maybe mid-20s. He said nothing, just started pounding on my passenger side window hard. I knew that car windows aren't easy to break, but he tried like hell. 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes. When he couldn't break it, he yanked at my side view mirror. I glanced in the rear view mirror, and the van had pulled a little farther back, maybe a length and a half, leaving me just enough space to reverse into the cross street behind me. I should have kept going forward, but fear makes you think strange things. I yelled at E to get down. My toddler was screaming by then, and I shifted into reverse. As I backed up, the van followed. The man who would have been at my window ran to the back door and started beating on it. And then a second man climbed out. He had a gun in his waistband. At that moment, the driver rolled her window down and shouted at them, and I'll never forget her words. "Just get back in the car. I didn't know she had her kids with her." The second man sneered at me. The second one spit through the crack of my barely opened window into my car, onto me, and onto the seat. He had started coming toward my side. And that was it. I hit the gas. I swerved forward, just missing him. My sons were crying and screaming. My hands were shaking so bad that I could barely dial 911, but I managed to call my husband once I got far enough away. When I finally stopped, I checked on the boys. N was still hiccuping with sobs, but calming. E was pale, silent, and absolutely terrified. For weeks after, he had nightmares. Even now, he still scans the road nervously when we drive. I've lived through a lot of trauma in my life. I've made mistakes, I've rebuilt myself, and I'm still healing, but at this moment, being boxed in with my children while strangers tried to attack etched itself into me and into my kids. I am proud of how far I've come, but that day, well, that day reminded me why I needed therapy in the first place. As the topic of this write-up is of the Islamic lore, it's proper that Tom wanted to open this with a quote. And I did not create the jinn and human beings except that they should worship me, from the Quran. And the rest of this is Tom's write-up. I have to start this by thanking Raven for letting me do this one, as it could be considered a bit of a niche topic. But it's one that I find absolutely fascinating, and I look forward to sharing it with you all. The jinn are some of the most prevalent entities in Islamic lore, and they're a very complicated species to really quantify. Some would call them ghosts, but that implies that they are undead, when they in fact do not fall into the category of undead whatsoever. Others equate these beings to demons, but even this isn't quite accurate, as this label implies that all jinn are malevolent beings, and, well, that's just not quite true. You see, while they feature very prominently in Islamic culture and lore, the origins of the jinn actually predate the Islamic faith, appearing in far older religions of the Middle East. Although in the Quran itself, when it speaks of the jinn, it does mention that much like humans, Allah gave the jinn free will. And this is something that I find incredibly interesting, because not even the angels were given free will. It also piques my curiosity because, being raised in a Western Christian household, I've always heard that only humans were given free will, and so to hear that there was another species given free will, it's actually really quite kind of exhilarating to me. So, while the jinn don't quite fit the label of ghost or demon, just because they have free will, it still doesn't quite make them fall suitably into the human category either. Although, just like humans, jinn have the capacity to be both good and evil. Some jinn are either believers in God, while others are not. So the very nature of the jinn is as varied and complex as that of the human condition. Since they're definitely a supernatural entity, and can be both good or evil, then the most suitable Western explanation to draw a parallel with, I would have to say, would be the Fae. The Fae are generally tied to nature or referred to as nature spirits, and that isn't far off from what jinn would be seen as in their native Middle East. They also have both good and evil Fae as well, as Fae that kind of play jump rope with the lines of morality. Fae also take up residence in trees, caves, and other places associated with nature or the outdoors. The same can be said of the jinn. If you were ever outdoors somewhere in the Levant and found you needed to relieve yourself, then most locals would probably caution you against doing so under a tree, as there might be a jinn living under that tree, and perhaps even sleeping there as we speak. And, well, it'd be quite rude, wouldn't it? The consequences of actually insulting a jinn in such a fashion could range from suffering incredibly poor luck, severe illness, and even death. But the jinn's relationship with humans can be even more complex than such encounters and reprisals. During my research on the jinn, I even found a fatwa issued in 2024 that spoke about using Muslim jinn as servants. I'll paraphrase a bit here, but the gist of it says that the world of jinn is real, and that to believe in it is obligatory. It also states that interactions between humans and jinns are not the norm, but states that a jinn may be subjugated and made to serve certain humans, just as other humans are often made to do. The fatwa cites the story of Solomon enslaving the demons and using them to build his temple in Jerusalem as a kind of basis or justification for using jinn in similar ways. This sounds even more messed up once we consider the fact that jinn have free will. And then we hit the ethical wall in regards to slavery and all of that other really dark stuff, which is probably a topic better suited to a different podcast than this one. Many of the entities in Islam today that are recognized as jinn actually date back before the existence of the Islamic faith, and are deity figures from the more ancient pagan tribes that once lived in the area that have kind of been annexed into the Islamic faith, even if their lofty titles of being some kind of god might have been downgraded slightly. But the cultures of the Levant have never had much in the ways of issues when it comes to co-opting other people's religious pantheon into their own. In fact, going back to the earliest days of civilization in the region, each town once had its own patron god, and when another city came to attack, it was common practice to carry the shrine or statue of the conquered city's deity back to the conquering city's temple. By doing this, you acknowledge the other civilization's god, but at the same time, declare the supremacy of your civilization's god. As such, the tradition of incorporating other societies' religious beliefs into their own dates far back before the time of Islam. Jinn, it seems, are no exception to this. And while some of them may have gone from being regarded as some kind of deity figure to something a bit more mundane, the fact remains that the jinn are as ancient as humanity. And if religious texts are to be believed, then we share a common origin as well as share space on this planet. While the jinn might be considered a largely Middle Eastern kind of thing, I'm compelled to tell you that this is really not the case. The jinn are definitely not a phenomenon restricted to the Middle East by any means. Let's keep in mind that, for all intents and purposes, they are like human beings, with their own agendas, wants, etc. Their, let's call it, society, would be pretty similar to ours. And so it seems to derive from this that jinn would of course want to travel and see as much of their world as we humans want to of ours. So, while they may not be called jinn in all corners of the world, you can certainly find entities that fit the general description of a jinn. In the Western world, the Fae have a lot in common with them. They're supernatural creatures with extremely long lifespans, and are often associated with magic and other extremely good or extremely bad fortune. Many times in stories, they are referred to as tricksters, who often try to lead humans astray, usually for their own amusement, or as punishment for some perceived slight. And sometimes in encounters, if someone is able to outwit the jinn or fae, they will often be granted some kind of prize or boon that often ends up being some kind of double-edged sword. The last thing really is an expression of a jinn's free will. The creature would be actively making a decision to engage with humans, either for its own entertainment or its own amusement. At least, I can only surmise that these would be the two primary motives for tricking or punishing humans. From the religious standpoint, it would probably seem as if the nefarious jinn were seeking to tempt humans into sin and draw them off the holy path and onto one of temptation. A kind of spiritual hurdle to be cleared in order to progress along one's religious journey and to grow. This, I suppose, could be why some people view them as demonic or infernal entities. Although, I would argue that there are humans that seek to do these kinds of things as well, and yet we don't classify them as demonic, but evil, most certainly. I think that it is truly interesting that jinn are such a common cultural phenomenon that even the dominant religion of the area has had to acknowledge them, and even make them a part of its dogma. But it's also intriguing that the jinn themselves have kind of transcended religion, and even fit into the more secular aspects of the culture. They feature in art and literature, both religious and not. In fact, we're all quite familiar with the famous jinni, or genie, from the story of Aladdin's lamp. Another famous story of a jinni also comes to us from the 1001 Arabian Nights, in the form of a story called The Fisherman and the Jinni. The story goes that a fisherman casts his net 4 times a day, and catches nothing but useless items until he retrieves a copper jar. When he opens the jar, he unleashes not the benevolent, if mischievous, jinni, such as from the story of Aladdin, but a creature that is fueled by vengeance. The Jinni have been imprisoned by King Solomon, and had sworn to grant whoever freed him from the jar their choice of death. The fisherman, realizing he's in terrible danger, questions the Jinni's power, saying that if it were so large and powerful, there is no way it could ever fit into such a tiny jar. Eager to prove its power, the Jinni shrinks itself down and re-enters the jar, allowing the fisherman to reseal the jar and save his own life. So while often described as incredibly or all-powerful paranormal or supernatural beings made of smokeless fire, even the most powerful and angry Jinn can be outsmarted if one has quick enough wits. The moral of the story actually teaches us that what seems to be an overwhelming powerful enemy can be defeated by means other than brute force. Not only teaching that there are non-violent solutions, but solutions that aren't always evident. But there are other famous tales about Jinn, many of them coming from the 1001 Arabian Nights. Some of these stories include Sinbad in the Valley of Diamonds, in which the titular character finds a valley full of diamonds that is guarded by a giant snake, which the famous sailor soon figures out is an evil Jinn in disguise. Again, using wit, the protagonist proves that even the most powerful Jinn can be outsmarted, and Sinbad escapes the valley with a substantial amount of the diamonds. Also, such stories as the City of Brass, where three explorers search for the fabled City of Brass, and tells of a brass vessel in which Solomon had trapped a Jinn, again highlighting the recurring theme of Jinn being bound to vessels such as pots or jars. It also once more links a specific story about a Jinn and King Solomon being the one to have sealed him. All in all, I would recommend anyone that is more curious about some of the Arabian lore, or anyone that loves a good adventure story, to check out the 1001 Arabian Nights as a whole. The stories tend to follow what could be called the traditional formula of an adventure tale, but you can't deny that the formula works, as most adventure stories today follow it almost to the letter. Most of the stories begin with the introduction to the protagonist, a brief overview of the journey he is currently in the middle of, and then we meet the antagonist or encounter whatever obstacle is on the path, and ultimately learn some kind of moral lesson as the brave hero escapes with the treasures, saves the girl, or otherwise emerges victorious from his tribulation. Simple, effective, and it makes for some of the best stories. In some ways, the tales that we have of the Jinn often have them serving as some kind of fodder for the tale of morality, or of overcoming the odds. The Jinn are often portrayed as arrogant and full of themselves, so very confident in their ability to best another mortal in some kind of twisted game of chance. All in all, I think the lessons that can be taken away from stories like these are that there are always unseen solutions to your problems, and just because you can't outfight a threat does not mean that all hope is lost. And there's always the chance that you can outsmart the seemingly unbeatable and all-powerful foe, even if it is supernatural. Then again, as I think about it, that sounds much like the Fae from the many morality tales from the Western world. Arthurian and Irish legends abound with similar stories of encounters with the Fae or fairy folk. Often, with them, the antagonist foil for the valiant king or Ireland's child of light. Oh, and just a little lore for you all. Did you know that the purpose behind knocking on wood is done to ask for a favor from the fairies? So, now you know what you are in fact doing when you, quote, knock on wood. So whether you call them Fae or you call them Jinn, make sure you consider who might be sleeping or otherwise residing under that nice shade tree before you relieve yourself while you're out camping or hiking. Hi, Raven. As they say, long-time listener, first-time submitter. I have a few stories to submit, but we'll start with the one that I often forget about because it was, frankly, so far out of left field for the kinds of things that happen, or rather don't happen, in my life. While I've had plenty of things happen that make me question the world we live in terms of spirituality, the Matrix, etc., this one was boiled down to simply mental illness, I believe. And while it wasn't necessarily scary in some of the other ways I've heard scary stories on the podcast, it was certainly weird, so feel free to use it or not use it as you see fit. On to the story. I was attending school at my local community college, wrapping up the 3 classes that I needed to complete as a 22-ish-year-old that had previously dropped out due to not knowing what the heck I was even going to school for. I had college credits from my high school days that were going to expire if I didn't obtain a degree, and so I begrudgingly signed up for the final 3 classes that I needed, as I knew I would like to continue with school eventually, and knew that this would save me both time and money in the long run. The story takes place in my Composition 2 class. The semester goes by fairly normal. The class is taught by an older woman, I guess probably in her mid to late 50s. She's on the slender side with graying hair and is one of those teachers that has a very specific way she wants to run her class, expects you to behave in class, and for how you'll turn in your work. Most of the people in this class are young adults, 18 or 19 years old with a few exceptions, myself being one of them. While being young and defiant isn't an unusual trait, I would say that I've been told that I was more headstrong than a bull at this age. And so I'm sure you can guess that I was not particularly fond of her rules for the sake of having rules. That said, I was an A student all throughout high school and college, and I wasn't going to break my streak now, so I found loopholes as needed throughout the semester. The teacher and I didn't fight per se, but I would push boundaries. Fast forward to the second to last day of class. We're supposed to be writing an essay for our final, and we have 2 days to do it. The classroom is silent as everyone faces their school-provided computers and types away. This was about 10 years ago, so every student having their own computer to bring to class wasn't necessarily common, though it was gaining traction. Maybe half to 3/4 of the way through the hour-long class, the teacher comes up to me and asks if she can talk to me in the hall. I tell her sure, and to be honest, I assumed she was going to grill me about being on my phone throughout the semester, and finally wanted to just lay it into me before she likely never saw me again. So, I'm mentally gearing up for this conversation in the few moments I have, as I follow her out to the hallway. She goes and sits down on a bench nearby and asks me to sit with her. I do, and she begins to start telling me about her husband and a therapist. It wasn't clear if it was her therapist, his, or theirs. How she had pictures and how she needed help. As you can imagine, I'm about as confused as it gets, both in terms of what she's telling me and why I'm the one she's telling it to, given my general attitude in the class. Treading carefully, I tell her that I can try and get her some help. I ask if there's someone I can call for her. She tells me no. She can't call anyone because they might be listening. After circling around this a few more times with nothing ever really making more sense to me, she finally says to me, "Didn't my people talk to your people? They told me they were going to." If you're wondering who any of the theys are, or who my people or her people are, congrats, you're as confused as I was in this moment. I tell her no, that no one has contacted me. At this point, she reiterates that she needs help and adds that she has to hide. And she can't go to her place or take her car because they are watching. She asks if I can take her to my home in my car. Stupidly, out of, I assume, shock, I say yes. I lived in Iowa at the time, and stuff like this just didn't and doesn't, I still live in Iowa, really happen here, so the shock factor is real. So then she asks me, a student, and still very young adult myself, tough girl image aside, what she should do about her class. I tell her that she should just let them know that she's dismissing class early. She goes up and does this, collects her things, and we go to my car and, again, stupidly I take her to my house. I was at a loss for what to do or how to help her, having honestly never dealt with anything remotely close to this in my life prior, and not having much knowledge on how mental illness can truly present itself. My justification aside, this was just dumb. Finally, I'm starting to get some sense back once we're at my house. I lived very close to the school, so probably only 30 or so minutes have elapsed since she pulled me out of the class. I told her to stay there and that I had to go run an errand, which was true. I shouldn't have left her in my house alone. Another stupid thing, but I also felt like I needed to get help, and I didn't feel like I could call anybody in front of her. I got in my car to run the quick errand and immediately called my mother, who, thankfully, is a very sane and grounded woman, and immediately provided some direction to my addled brain. She told me that I should not have left the woman in my house. She could be planting drugs or any number of crazy things, she said, understandably. And that she was going to call the school, and after verifying that I didn't feel in danger, suggested that I go back home and bring her back to the school. I want to clarify that if I had not felt safe, either my mother or I would have called the police, and that she was in no way suggesting I go back into the situation that I was scared to be in. So my mother and I did the things she said. She quickly called back after calling the school and told me where to drop the teacher off at. Back at my home, I convinced her that, quote, my people, cleared us to go back to the school where they could help her. I dropped her off with the security guard and left in a daze. I didn't hear much about what exactly happened to her other than she was going to get the help that she needed. I did get pulled out of my night class later that day in front of everyone, which was dramatic as you can imagine, and I had to give a statement to the night dean and head of security. Afterwards, my night class teacher held me after class and tried to let me know that she was here in case I needed to talk about anything. To this day, I'm not sure if she meant it or was just curious about what happened. But either way, I thanked her and didn't comment. I didn't tell anyone at the school outside of the dean and security what happened, as I felt bad for the woman, and honestly, awkward for myself. The last day of English class, there was a substitute teacher for our final. I couldn't even tell you the original teacher's name to try and look her up now, but this was such a wild experience that I often forget it even happened to me. I will say that this experience did make me much more aware of what to do in surprising situations like this. So, while it certainly wasn't ideal, I'm in a way glad that a safe, crazy experience happened to me. It's easy to say you'll do XYZ when something happens to you, but it's so much different in the moment than it is just thinking about it. The situation helped prepare me to be much more on my toes, regardless of shock, and I'm sure it helped me navigate life in a much safer way that I potentially would not have if I had not had this experience. Oh, and for those of you wondering, I did get my associate's degree from the community college. After taking an approximately 2-year break, I also enrolled in a 4-year school at the age of 25, completed my bachelor's, and then continued on to get my master's and found relevant employment in my field. Not knowing what you want to do right away out of high school can feel scary too, as well as dropping out of college, which I also did. So, there's a little mini scary story with a happy ending in there as well. Thanks for listening and reading if this makes it, and stay safe. I have a pretty basic and kind of nothing happened sort of story from when I was a kid, but it scared the ever-loving hell out of me back then, and I really don't have answers for it other than the obvious possibilities. This all happened when I was 13, so mid-90s. My parents used to occasionally go out to their friend's house on Saturday night to have a group dinner and play cards. It wasn't an every weekend thing, more like an every 2 to 3 weeks. They would leave me home with my older brother, David. David was newly 17, had a new girlfriend that he'd been with for a few months, and he was good about telling me he'd be back before my parents, and if I told them that he was sneaking out, he would unalive me. So, on those nights, it was just me. Our house was pretty old. It had a few spots in the living room and hallway that would pop and creak when you walked through. It was pretty much impossible to do anything in the main area at night in a sneaky way. I was pretty well used to the usual sounds when people were around. None of it scared me. Of course, when you're alone and you hear those sounds, things feel a bit different. I was in the living room reading a book when nature called. I didn't like the half bath that was downstairs, so I went up the stairs to the full bathroom to do what I needed to do. After a few moments while I was up there, I heard what sounded like a rhythmic thumping sound. Like a soft thump, 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 thump. Like heavy but slow steps. It sounded like someone was walking through the back part of the house, near the back door and kitchen. At first I thought I was just hearing things, old house sounds of the furnace kicking on or something like that, but then there was the telltale sign that there was, in fact, somebody downstairs. The pop and squeak of that living room floorboard. There was, without a doubt, someone walking around down in the living room. And there I was, caught with my pants down with nothing to protect me from someone with malicious intent but a flimsy bathroom door. At least the knob locked, so I guess there's that. I stood there with my ear to the door trying to listen for where the person was walking to. Of course, I had a few thoughts. Maybe David was home early. Maybe it was my parents that were home early and David was going to be unalived by my dad. But something told me that it wasn't either one. I think it was how slowly they were walking around. My throat was dry and my heart was beating fast. I think I just instinctually knew that this was not someone that should be in my house. I know that sounds silly, but at that age, I think I was just trying to will it to be my family, because anyone else was too terrifying of a possibility. Then, I heard someone call out, "Hey, David, are you here?" But they didn't, yell it out. They called it out creepily, almost sing-song-like. Like they were intentionally trying to be creepy, stretching out all the syllables of every word. At that point, I was obviously certain that it wasn't anyone in my family, but it was someone that knew my brother. Again, I thought maybe they were just a friend of his, but why would they have broken into the mostly dark house in the middle of a Saturday night, instead of knocking on the door or calling to see if he was there? I turned the bathroom light off just in case they came up the stairs. I didn't want them to see that someone was in the bathroom. And I listened. I could hear the person walking around and calling out for David again. Then it sounded like they were rifling through some random things. Like they were looking for something, but not finding what they were looking for. After a few more moments of all that, I heard the person walk toward the steps. Then step on to the first step. Again, my heart was pounding. I thought for sure they were going to find me. Now, I don't believe in guardian angels or anything like that, but if they exist, then mine was absolutely looking out for me at that exact moment in time. On the stairs, my dad had installed one of those carpet runners. The kind that you attach to the stairs firmly and tightly so that it doesn't move, but it protects the steps. Well, the third step, however, was partially detached. My fault. And if you stepped on it wrong, it could slip. It wouldn't slip completely off the step, but just enough that if you weren't paying attention, you could very easily lose your footing. I think you probably see where this is going, because this home intruder's lack of knowledge of our house worked out in my favor. I heard him take the first step, quietly say David again in that stretched out way, and then I heard him slip, a very loud thud, and then him screaming a few F-bombs. After a few minutes of him yelling and groaning in pain, I heard another voice say, "Holy shit, dude, are you okay?" I wanted to panic about the fact that there were two guys in the house, not just the one, but I also wanted to laugh my ass off at the fact that this idiot had broken into our home and most likely bashed his head onto the top step while committing his crime. The first guy said something like, "I hit my head on the steps. I can't effing see straight, dude." They talked back and forth for a few more moments, and in their conversation, the second person said that they would just get what they needed from David later, and that they needed to get him to the hospital. Of course, he argued asking what they would tell them since they were kind of doing something illegal, and the second guy just said, "Just tell them you fell on the stairs. They don't need to know whose stairs." And then I heard them walk back to the living room and out the back door. I sat there for several more minutes just soaking in the whole event. I was terrified, absolutely. I was scared witless, but I was also laughing so damn hard. After about 5 or 10 more minutes, I decided that I needed to get downstairs and call the cops, or my parents, or something. I ran to the phone, and there, attached to the counter near it, was a post-it that said, "If anything happens, call me first," with a number that I assumed was my brother's girlfriend's house. So I called that just because I didn't really know what else to do. After about 10 minutes, David came running in the back door asking me if I was okay and what the hell happened. I told him that 2 guys had broken in and were looking for him because they, quote, needed something from him. I told him about how the guy started up the stairs, but that he tripped and bashed his head on the steps, and then they left. The thing that was weird was that David honestly couldn't figure out who it was, or why they were there. I know that some people could say that he was probably dealing drugs or owed somebody money, but he really wasn't that kind of person. He did drink when he was a teenager, but he was never really interested in any drugs or anything, so he really could not figure out why they would have been there to try to scare him or what they were wanting to get. So, this was my creepy Home Alone story, and yeah, like I said, nothing really happened. But it certainly scared the hell out of me. I never did get answers about any of this, and we never did tell my parents. David, my brother, passed away in 2023 from an accident at his work, but this was one of those secrets that he and I kept. And after a few years, we were able to laugh about the time that some dude broke into our house and probably gave himself a concussion, while 13-year-old me sat in the bathroom less than 10 feet away, laughing my ass off the whole time. So, today, I'm going to look into one of the most shocking and brutal serial killers in modern times. The things he did rocked an entire nation in the wake of a very difficult time in the entire region. When these crimes began to take place, the Arab Spring was just starting to wind down and de-escalate. So while the people of Cairo were used to petty street crimes, theft, harassment, scams and cons, or even a certain level of political violence and unrest, when this serial killer struck, it blew everyone's minds. The police at the time were especially concerned with projecting the image of being orderly and well in control of public safety. After the craziness during the Arab Spring, they very much needed to protect that image. So in 2017, when they discovered evidence of incredibly shocking crimes, after some inconsistent statements in relation to missing persons cases, the police finally searched the home of one Radi Mohammed Abdelrahman, and found human remains buried both under the floors and in his yard. In some cases, for years, families of these missing people had been pushing for justice, looking for answers. The discovery of the crimes wasn't exactly amazing police work, or as a result of any kind of intensive investigations. Once he was arrested, Roddy confessed to a number of murders. While there's heavy suspicion that he was guilty of other disappearances and subsequently other murders, he was only ever convicted of 4. Although, regardless of how many he was convicted of, it was definitely enough because in 2019 he was convicted of 4 murders and sentenced to death. Roddy tried to appeal the sentence, but it was upheld in court. And in 2021, the Butcher of Giza was executed by hanging in a prison in Giza. Now, just what were the crimes that earned a man a date with the gallows? Well, they were pretty horrific. The crimes themselves were brutal, but perhaps the most disturbing thing is how Roddy dealt with his crimes in the aftermath. He literally managed to continue living a seemingly normal life while at the same time living amongst the remains of his victims, and some of them buried right underneath the floor he walked on. The crimes themselves took place over about 2 years, starting in 2015. The Butcher of Gaza's first victim was one of his own childhood friends, whereas the majority of Roddy's victims were women that were attached to him through promises of marriage or financial stability. Rita was a longtime friend. Their relationship was based on financial matters and mutual trust. While Rita's family didn't approve of his friendship with Roddy, who they felt took advantage of Rita's generosity, and generous is what Rita was, especially with people close to him, oftentimes lending his friends large sums of money. I will take a beat here to say that a lot of the more personal details of the victims have not been reported to the Egyptian media. Only the first names of the victims are given, so sadly I do not know Rita's family name or any of the victims that came after him. Although, I think maybe that's the most dignified way to present the case. For a long time, Rita's friendship with Roddy was fairly stable. As I said, it was built upon a mutual kind of trust between the longtime friends. However, in 2015, Rita would make what turned out to be a fatal mistake. He confronted Roddy about repayment. He was pressuring Roddy to at least make a show of good faith. Instead, what happened was that Roddy would lure his friend into a situation under the promise of settling accounts. Rita arrived at his friend's apartment expecting recompense. What he received was a violent blow to the back of his head, according to most reports. Other reports suggest possible strangulation was involved, but the dominant narrative is blunt force. What is usually agreed upon is that it was a very violent death directly tied to a financial dispute. When the Butcher of Giza went to remove his first victim, it was a bit different to later crimes, as he didn't bury his friend under the floorboards or even on his property. Rita was buried on a different property. For years, when he was confronted about Rita's disappearance, Roddy would just state that Rita had left the country or had just disappeared. He was hopeful that this kind of narrative would curb any future inquiries. It was the opposite that occurred, though, as Rita's family would continually hound the police about the disappearance for years after. One of the earliest victims that was traced directly to the Butcher of Giza, Nawal's case is a bit unique among the Butcher's victims. Nawal was more intimately connected to the killer. Nawal was a woman in her 40s that had actually been in a pretty serious relationship with Roddy. However, once Nawal began to press him on marriage, wanting to cement their relationship in a more permanent way, well, that was her fatal mistake. In 2015, Nawal was lured to Roddy's apartment. Once she was there, the Butcher attacked her. According to the report, she was struck in the head. The truly tragic part is what came after. Once Nawal was dead, the Butcher buried her under the floor of his apartment, where her body would remain for 2 years. In the aftermath of Nawal's disappearance, Roddy maintained that she had left the country to find work abroad. In Egypt, where people migrating to find work in other countries is commonplace to most people, this sounded completely plausible. Nawal's family, however, was never convinced by his story, and much like Rita's family, Nawal's family continued to pressure the police to keep investigating. Faten was a kind-hearted young woman from Giza, who would also most unfortunately fall into the orbit around the Butcher. She became friends with Roddy and became a confidant and good friend to the butcher. Much like Rita, Fatan was very trusting of the people close to her and had the utmost faith in them. Unlike Nawal, Fatan's connection to Roddy wasn't romantic. In fact, it was a completely platonic relationship that was based on trust and closeness. Fatan often went to Roddy for advice or to confide in him. The fact that they were so close, and that there was so much trust between them, made what happened to Fatan all the more terrible and completely sinister. The butcher would ultimately lead her to one of the properties he was using. Once Fatan arrived, he again struck her in the head with the blunt object, and then he would conceal her body in the same building where Nawal was buried. Of course, Fatan's family found her sudden disappearance both inexplicable and very shocking. Roddy, however, was able to pretty successfully keep up the ruse of being her trusted friend, etc. Fatan's family wouldn't learn of her true fate for 2 years, when her remains were found at the same time as Nawal's. The final person that the butcher was convicted of killing was Yasmin, a 20-year-old woman from Giza. And she was the youngest of his victims. Yasmin was working at a clothing store at the time of her death. Family and friends say that she was ambitious and had high hopes for a more stable future, and she was willing to put in the hard work to get there. Unlike Rita, Nawal, or Fatan, Yasmin wasn't bound to Roddy by some kind of long, intimate history. But she was friendly enough with him that she made the fatal mistake of trusting him. There are some conflicting reports as to just how he managed to lure her into his web. Some say he had told her that he could or was going to arrange a job for her. Others say he was trying to propose marriage. And yet others say that he was offering her the prospect of some kind of new start. Whatever carrot he dangled in front of her, he unfortunately got exactly what he wanted. It was in 2017 when Yasmin, the last confirmed victim of the Butcher of Giza, disappeared. Much as with Nawal or Fatan, he lured her to his Giza apartment and killed her with a blunt force strike to her head. That pattern always remained consistent among the confirmed victims of Roddy. After she was dead, she too joined Nawal and Fatan under the tiled floor of the apartment. As with the other three, Roddy tried to spin a story that Yasmin had left the country to begin fresh somewhere far away. Yasmin's family was never even remotely trusting of his story. It would be completely out of character for the young woman to do something like that. Ultimately, it was the disappearance of Yasmin and the relentless urging of her family to investigate further that would ultimately lead to Roddy's discovery and arrest. For some of the families, they were for the first time learning just what had happened after years of not knowing. Each one of these deaths is tragic and completely pointless. There was nothing to be gained by any of them, really. I think in the case of Rita, the killing was less about the money, and almost certainly an impulsive decision by Roddy. And that's all Tom K's personal speculation. In most cases like this, there has been something brewing beneath the surface for a long time, and then a catalyzing event will happen, and that's when they explode and do something such as cracking a trusted friend in the head with a blunt object. Again, I can't say for certain that is the case. That's just the general pattern of these kinds of stories. So, there it is, the story of Rita, Nawal, Fatan, and Yasmin. 4 human beings with loved ones and dreams of a better future robbed of everything by one incredibly disturbed and selfish man, the Butcher of Giza. But I'm not going to let him have the last word here, so thank you for taking the time to listen, and thank you as always to my dear friend Raven. Much love to you all. This happened when I was in my mid-20s, right before COVID temporarily killed the concert scene, though I know for some it permanently killed it. I went to a concert that honestly should have just been a fun night out, but it ended up being a let's not meet again encounter with a creepo. The show was at a mid-sized venue in town, not a massive arena, but bigger than a hole-in-the-wall kind of place. It could house somewhere between a few hundred to couple thousand people at most, though I'm going to be honest, I know jack about venue size or how many people can legally fit in a box. That night, it was definitely at capacity, though. There were a lot of people, and we were all getting to know each other pretty well. If you get what I mean. The band playing was one of my favorites. They were the opener for the headliner. Loud, energetic kind of music that you'll regret in the morning. That's the kind of show it was. I usually went to these concerts with friends, but that night no one else was free, so it was just me. This isn't a common thing. I really didn't like doing things like this alone, but I was really wanting to go, so I went. I made my way through the crowds, a handful of rows back from the stage, and I was there when they got on stage and started their first song. As soon as the first song ended, that's when it all started. At first it was subtle, just a bump from behind. He pressed against me just a bit too close. Normally this would be just a thing that unfortunately happens in a crowd, but it didn't feel accidental. It kind of felt intentional. Like he had pushed his body against mine on purpose. Again, it's something that does happen. Creep's gonna creep. So I just took a deep breath, recomposed myself, and got into the second song that was now playing. Then, it happened again. Except this time there was a hand that touched my side. I jumped and gave a bit of a startled yelp. Definitely not something I expected. I quickly pulled away from his hand and turned around to see who the hell thought that was okay. And that's when my stomach dropped. This guy wasn't even watching the stage. He was just standing there and staring at me. He was tall, mid-30s I'd say, with a baseball cap and a hoodie pulled up. No band shirt, no excitement on his face, just an empty expression staring down at me. He almost looked like he was literally there to just creep hunt people, not for the show. And somehow that was so much worse than it just being some drunk dude being a bit handsy at random. I gave him a what the hell look, like raising my eyebrows and gesturing for him to move forward if that's what he was wanting to do, but he didn't pass me. He stayed glued to his spot, just staring at me like he didn't understand what I was trying to convey, and moving his head to watch me as I moved to the side. I tried to get back into the music, but as soon as I turned around to watch the band, I immediately felt him press against me again. This time closer and more, I guess, intimate, you could say. I could literally feel his breath on my neck, and that was just gross. At this point, I spun around and yelled, "Back the hell up!" I thought that he would get it, would say sorry, or would react in some way, shape, or form, but he just stared at me again with no expression. I was being rushed with adrenaline and was hitting a boiling point. I said screw it and shoved sideways through people, trying to find somewhere else to stand that was nowhere near him. I pushed off to the left side of the stage. I was on the right side initially, and found another spot a little further back. When I stopped, I paused to look around to see if he was there too, but I didn't see him, so I thought I was safe. Of course, I wasn't though. Within a couple of minutes, I felt another push against me, and when I turned around again, it was him. Same expressionless stare and silence. It's hard to explain how terrifying it is to be surrounded by hundreds of people and yet still feel completely singled out. I wanted to yell, but the music was drowning out everything. I wanted to get help, but I wasn't really sure who I could go to take care of this situation. Part of me was also worried that, if I pushed away or tried to run, he may escalate. He clearly had no issue being seen, had no problem with being noticed and yelled at or leered at or anything. So how far would he go? After staring at him for the duration of an entire song, it finally ended, and there was a small break in the energy. I bolted past him through the crowd, ignoring all the angry stares I was getting from people that didn't understand my predicament. About halfway to the back of the crowd, I looked back, and shocker, he was about 15 feet behind me, following in my direction. I think that was when it really hit me that this guy wasn't just being a creep. It wasn't a coincidence. He was completely and totally focused on me. For some reason, I had caught this guy's obsession for the night, and he wasn't going to let it go. Thankfully, while I was pushing to the back, I noticed that there were marked security guards for the venue near the bar. I flagged one of them down and shouted that there was a guy that kept touching me and was following me and that it was really starting to freak me out. Thankfully, the guard took me seriously, because when he looked up and noticed the guy, his face changed to a look of aggression, and he stepped forward, blocking the man from coming any closer. And, just like that guy's demeanor shifted. He went from that blank expression to a fake grin. He even laughed and shrugged at the guard, saying, "I was just having fun, man, chill out." The guard wasn't buying it. He told the man to back off and walked me toward the balcony area, which overlooked the stage. He told me that he'd be by the bar all night, in the same spot, and if that guy came anywhere near me, to tell him and he would take care of it. I thanked him and headed up the stairs to the balcony where I watched the rest of the show, though, to be honest, I really didn't feel like being there. I think I felt obligated, though, since I had paid for the ticket, so I had to see it through to the end. The headliner came on and finished up the show, and thankfully the guy didn't come up toward the balcony. I did see him again after the show ended, walking through the crowd as everyone filtered out, looking around like he was trying to find something. I'd wager money that that something he was trying to find was me. I actually sat up on the balcony for a while after the show ended, just to make sure that everyone did filter out and to make sure there was no way I was going to run into him again. The guard actually came up to see if I was still there, and he walked me to the front to make sure I didn't run into him, which I appreciated. At least, he genuinely seemed to care. I'll never know what that guy's deal was, other than he was just being a really pervy creep. He never said a single word to me. By the way he followed me and kept following me, I have to make assumptions that he had malicious intent, but he just didn't get the chance to do what he wanted. Like he was waiting for the right moment to, dare I say it, pounce. I haven't been to another concert since this happened for various reasons, though this was definitely one of the big ones. Any event that I do go to now, I refuse to go alone just in case. I know it was kind of an empty event, but I feel like this all could have gone much, much worse if he got the chance to corner me. He did teach me one major life lesson, though. Sometimes the scariest people aren't the loud, rambunctious ones making a scene. Sometimes they're the ones who stay completely silent. Hey, Raven. While I'm relatively new to your podcast, I enjoy listening to them at work. I especially love the paranormal stories, though my life seems to lack those kind of events. Instead, I have a small story about being home alone that, while it ended perfectly fine, could have ended far worse. I grew up in a rather rural town/city in the 90s. The typical safe neighborhood with my best friend down the street, and we'd either be playing at his house, mine, or exploring our block on our bikes without a care in the world. At the time of this story, I was around 11, and my friend was a year younger. This day, we were at my house in the basement playing video games. At some point, my mom called down to us to let us know that she had to go out to the store for a few things, and she'd be back in a short while. We did the normal, okay, and thought nothing else of it. Just went back to the game. I don't know how long after it was when we heard my dog upstairs barking up a storm. This wasn't uncommon, but he'd normally calm down after a few seconds. He didn't. Even after I called up to him, he was insistent. So, finally, I went upstairs to check out what was going on, my friend right behind me. One important detail about the house, coming up the stairs, You'd be looking straight at the back doors to the house that connected to a covered but open-access carport. There were 2 doors, a solid wood one and a glass/mesh one. Well, as I came up the stairs, I saw that the wooden door was open as it always was on summer days, leaving just the glass one. My dog was in front of the door still barking, and just as I was about to call out to him, I saw on the other side of the door 2 strange adults walking by. We froze. For a couple of seconds, we didn't know what to do, but then we dashed to the wooden door, closed it, and locked the deadbolt as fast as we could. After I looked through the peephole and then saw the same 2 people walking in the opposite direction, this time leaving the carport. Quickly moving to a window facing the front yard, we closed the curtains and then peeled out to see a total of 5 adults, all of different ages, and 2 of them holding a couple bags of items taken from the carport. We then watched as they walked away. It was maybe a minute or 2 later while we were discussing what to do, and this was before cell phones, so there was no way to contact my mom, that my mom's car rolled up into the driveway. We immediately went to her and explained what had happened. After that, my mom calmed us down and told us that we did the right thing. And she always made sure to close and lock the wooden door after that when she stepped out. The stuff taken was mostly junk and a lot of empty cans, so the value of it was low. And in the end, there really was no damage. But I still wonder what could have happened if my dog hadn't been barking and caused a fuss at the door. After all, it was just a single pane of glass and some mesh. Easy to get through. Would those 2 people have tried to go inside the house? Would all 5? We were 2 young kids. It's not like we would have been able to do anything to stop them. Oh, and for those wondering, yes, my dog did get lots of praise, pets, and treats that day. He was always a good boy, but that day he wasn't just a good boy, but a great protector. Hello. First, I wanted to say thank you for reading my story if you do, because I've been listening to you for quite some time now. But also, I know that my story isn't the normal kind that you get. You typically tell stories from the people who experience it, or, unfortunately, deal with the creeps and jerks out there, but this time, I was the jerk, to put it lightly. I was the person that changed the lives of at least 4 people, and believe me, I did not take it lightly. I take full responsibility for everything that happened, and I know there are no excuses for my behavior either. I'm a much different person now, so everyone understands, but when I was in my 20s, I was not the same person I am today. And I take this lesson very seriously, because it could have turned out a lot worse. Back then, I was a complete mess. I thought I was just a confident driver, which was really code for reckless and dangerous, but I didn't care. I rarely wore my seatbelt unless I saw a cop nearby. I regularly looked at speed limits as suggestions rather than law. I even tailgated people who I thought were going too slow until they got out of my way. I was the guy that everyone hated on the roads, and at the time, I didn't care. I was young, I thought I was invincible, and in the nice flashy car that I got with the money I saved up by myself, I thought it was earned. I did get a few speeding tickets before this, which I did dutifully pay off, but not without being an ass to everyone at the courthouse, which I'm also embarrassed by. I was definitely living carelessly, and I regret it. The day everything changed started out as a normal crappy day. My girlfriend and I had been fighting lately about everything and nothing. Money, my attitude, my priorities, you name it. That morning I left in a bad mood, so I knew when I got home we would probably pick up where we left off. My parents had been on my case lately too about me getting my own insurance plan. I had just been giving them money for my part of it, but after 3 speeding tickets, they didn't want me on their plan. Understandably so. And then my job always seemed to find a way to piss me off. My boss decided that he wanted to act like he knew what was going on in the team, now that corporate was coming down, so he had been micromanaging everyone, so pretty much all of us were in bad moods. Needless to say, I was already in a foul mood when I left work that Tuesday evening at around 6 p.m. It was that time of year where the sun was just starting to set, so we had the nice orange skies going on. Probably about the only nice thing that evening. I just wanted to get home to play some stupid game, drink a beer, and forget about the world for a few hours. I was driving down a main road surrounded by commercial buildings, trying to get to the highway. The road was a single lane with a 30-mile-per-hour speed limit. I stopped at a red light, and after my light turned green, there was a car on my left that also turned, cutting me off. His left turn light would have been red because my straight light had turned green. I immediately honked my horn, clearly annoyed by this, and then went straight. Now I was behind this jerk, and not only did he cut me off, but he was also going under the speed limit. Again, I'm going to try to explain this in my mindset for that time in my life, so before anyone jumps at me in the comments here. He was going about 27 miles per hour in a 30, when I normally go 5 to 10 over that. It made it feel like a crawl. I was pretty heated by this. If he wouldn't have cut me off, this wouldn't have been a problem. But since he did, I was already mad at him and growing more and more angry. So I did what I normally did. I started tailgating immediately, getting maybe 3 feet behind them. They didn't even look up, so I flashed my brights at them a few times and then eventually left them on. The sun was starting to set, so I knew that he had to have seen my lights. But again, he did nothing, not even adjusting his mirror. As my anger increased, I became more and more aggressive. We passed 2 speed limit signs, and as we did, I would honk and point at the sign, yelling at him that it's 30. I know that I would have looked insane to anyone on the outside, but to him, it was like I wasn't even there. He continued on at his speed, didn't glance up at me, didn't even flip me off. I had finally run out of any bit of patience I had left. I needed to pass this guy. I veered over a little to see if anyone was coming, and when I saw the opposite lane was empty, I took the chance. I swerved into the other lane, sped up to pass this guy, expecting to see some older person or maybe someone just not paying any attention to what they were doing. But instead, I saw a guy in his 30s, maybe 40s at the latest, who was wearing sunglasses and some kind of chunky Bluetooth earpiece. He was just driving normally, arm resting on the window, looking completely calm, his mouth moving like he was talking to someone or maybe singing. Either way, the guy pissed me off, so I flipped him off. He looked over at me, and at that moment, he looked confused and his smile was gone. This irritated me even more because how could he not understand why I was so annoyed with him? Either way, I was determined to cut him off, so I sped up to get ahead. The problem with this is that what I was doing is very illegal and very dangerous. I was in the oncoming traffic lane and was so caught up in the rage that I didn't see the car coming toward me. I reacted quickly and hard swerved back over to the correct lane. I assume I barely gave the guy behind me enough space because he started honking, and he seemed to slowly put more and more space between us. The car in the other lane passed as normal. I made comments to the driver now behind me as I left him behind, and, once again, was not paying attention to the road in front of me. Coming up faster than I could react was an intersection with a stoplight. My light was red, and there was no way that I could slow down in time. Now, running the red light was not good. It's not something I usually did, but I would deal with it. What I couldn't avoid was the sedan on the intersecting lane to my right trying to turn left. They had a green light and had every right to turn. And yet, here I was, about to stop them. About to do the exact thing the guy behind me had done to me. Everything went in slow motion. I hit the brakes as hard as I could, but I knew it wasn't going to be enough. I was going to blow right through that red light at probably 45 miles per hour. I just remember thinking with perfect clarity, I'm going to kill them. The impact was devastating. I T-boned their car right in the driver's side door. The sound was stomach-turning, a horrible combination of metal crushing, glass exploding, and then suddenly an awful silence. I wasn't wearing a seatbelt, of course, and I felt myself being lifted up. But I stiffened at that moment, and my head smashed into the windshield, and then everything went dark. The next thing I remember is someone pulling me out of my car. There were voices all around me asking my name, asking if I could hear them. My head was pounding and I could taste blood. But the worst part, even through the pain, was hearing a child crying somewhere in the background. It was heartbreaking, terrifying sobs, and it cut right through my confusion. When they loaded me into the ambulance, one of the EMTs asked if I knew what happened. The only thing I could manage to say, and the only thing that came out of me was, I effed up. Because even in my concussed, shocked state, I knew this was entirely my fault. I was in the hospital for 3 days with a severe concussion, whiplash, cuts all over the top of my head, my face, and arms from the broken glass. Somehow my head broke the windshield, but I didn't fly out, which is probably the only reason I was still alive. But those physical injuries were nothing compared to learning about all the damage I had caused. I learned that the car I hit was a dad, a mom, and their 4-year-old daughter. The dad, who was driving, ended up with some broken ribs and a fractured wrist. Mom had a concussion and bruises. Thank God their daughter was in a car seat, which probably saved her life. She got banged up and pretty badly traumatized, I'm sure, but was okay otherwise. My car was totaled and completely unsalvageable. Their car was totaled too. My insurance covered some of it, but since I was at fault, and it wasn't something unavoidable like my car malfunctioning, I ended up having to pay nearly $30,000 out of pocket for their medical bills, car replacements, and other expenses. It took me a very long time to pay it off. The financial burden wasn't even the worst part. My parents were very disappointed in me. My dad tore me a new one about how irresponsible and stupid I was, and he was right. My mom didn't say much, but she cried a lot, which hurt me to see. Then my girlfriend came to the hospital to check on me. She said that she was happy to know I was okay, but after she helped me back home from the hospital, she broke up with me. And she explained that we clearly weren't working out and that I needed to work on myself first. Again, I knew she was right. I knew that I was the problem. The only thing I had left was my job, and I barely had that. My boss had no sympathy for me and still demanded the same amount of work. And since that was the only thing I had left, I dove right into it. I worked overtime, didn't have a social life. I didn't even have a car. I tried doing one of the taxis, but I was just burning money that I no longer had, so I started taking the bus. I could at least get bus passes that were cheaper. For months following, I had to go to court and plead guilty to reckless driving, running the red light. The judge said that I was lucky because if any of them had died, I'd have been looking at vehicular manslaughter charges. I became a complete wreck. The guilt and shame was worse than the pain and physical healing ever was. I kept hearing that poor girl's cries, and there were a few times where I couldn't sleep at all, knowing how close I came to almost ending 3 lives because I was selfish and impatient. But, as horrible as this experience was, it absolutely changed me as a person. Gradually, I started to understand myself and my life. I couldn't afford a therapist, but I read books and watched videos. I focused on my attitude and how to express my anger. I realized that I was channeling all of it when I drove. That was my escape, my way of letting it all out, but that wasn't healthy. I wasn't just going for a drive to clear my head, I was using the road as my punching bag. The changes that I made were gradual and the road was long, but I got there. I had to earn my parents' trust back, and I still don't think they fully trust me nearly 2 decades later. But I can tell they are proud of me. I never did get back with my ex, but I think that's for the best. We truly were just creating a toxic environment for each other. I paid off the lawsuits. I have a used car, but it's also paid off. And my insurance is a little higher, as expected. But I'm a completely different person now. I wear my seatbelt, I go the speed limit, and I certainly don't lose my cool like I used to. I still do get peeved at people running red lights and things like that, but I handle it a lot better. So, there's my story. I nearly killed a family because I was mad at another stranger, a person that I never saw again. Our lives could have been completely different, and for some reason I was given a second chance. And I certainly didn't take it for granted. So if anyone learns anything from this, just please slow down. Put on your seatbelt and just let it go. Let the feeling pass and live your life. Because the few minutes you think that you'll save, or the revenge you think you're getting, will never be worth spending the rest of your life knowing that you destroyed someone else's. First of all, I love your voice, Raven. It's soothing to me, my mom, and my sister. We all listen to your podcast. Thank you. Second, I'm bad at spelling, but I'm sure you can get what I'm trying to say. Third, I'm not trying to get anyone to believe in what I believe in. For context, my grandma used to babysit us a lot. And not that it matters, but my sister is about 2 years younger than me. She's a funny, caring, and kind lady. I've had plenty of paranormal experiences in my life, and yes, I believe in it. I was little, like a toddler at the time, and this happened several times. My grandma told me about this, by the way. I would go into our living room just fine with others, but when my grandma would tell me to go watch TV, I would tell her that the boy was in there. My grandma would say that there was no one in there, but I thought there was a scary little boy in there. I even remember what he looked like. She would turn on the TV and I would be fine. But I was persistent that this boy existed, and that he stayed in the living room. This is one of my many paranormal experiences. I would normally think this was an imaginary thing that I made up as a kid, but I remember this little boy, and I was terrified. Also, my grandma would never tell me something like this and have it be false. It has been far too long, Raven, and I miss you guys. Miss you too, Fox. I finally had time between everything going on in my life to share one of the many crazy stories that happened recently, and this one is from a couple of months ago. I don't know who might be triggered by this story because it does deal with some racism and what might be considered an attempted kidnapping and or homicide, but rest assured that everyone is okay. I was on my way back from dropping off a DoorDash order, mainly because I still do deliveries when I want to make some extra cash to pay for equipment or other things. And this time I was actually out dashing for some extra cash to get gifts for my wife's upcoming birthday. We live in an area that's developing but still has some rural aspects to it, including a small cluster of little towns that still hold their traditional ways and looks. Without giving out too much detail on where we live, sometimes there are signs, flags even, that let you know an area isn't as welcoming as you'd hope. We avoid these places, but apps like DoorDash don't really differentiate an area as being dangerous or risky until enough people in that area mark it as such, or have issues with residents. Well, I ended up in one of these areas, and it was nighttime and raining heavily. Back roads are often 2 lanes and dark except for any illumination caused by your headlights, but I don't have a problem seeing at night, so I stuck it out to drive as long as I could, despite the rain. I ended up being cut off by a very old Ford pickup truck with a Confederate flag on the back of it, which started off behind me a distance and then quickly caught up to me and pulled into the opposite side traffic lane aggressively. The driver blew his horn and sped around my car. I could also see he had someone in his passenger seats, and at first I thought nothing of it. But they did seem to stay at my left-hand side for a few seconds longer than I liked. We were approaching a roundabout up ahead, and they of course gunned it to pass me, and went into the roundabout where they circled it twice, and then seemed to go on their way. I forgot all about it and went back to listening to one of Raven's older stories sent in by truckers, because it helps me to stay awake and I'm a fan. A few minutes passed and I realized that I didn't stop for gas like I intended to, and my needle was hovering on E and threatening to ruin my night. So, against better judgment, I pulled into one of the only gas stations I saw within the next 10 miles on the map. I parked at the pump and walked inside the store, where I immediately felt something was off as the cashier stared me down. He was an older Caucasian man, handlebar mustache, American flag bandana on his head, and he didn't seem to like that I walked in. I wasn't sure if he was on the phone or not, but I heard him say something along the lines of, "Hold on a minute," through a thick southern drawl, and then he went silent. I asked him for gas, told him what pump I was at, and he chuckled and shook his head. "You don't know where you're at, do you, boy?" he asked me. I didn't answer him, but I did give him a sharp glare back and then scoffed at him, and walked toward the door to exit when he decided to add to his statement. "I didn't say he couldn't get gas, but I would definitely suggest you hurry up before the wrong party sees it," he warned me. I turned to look at him, visibly irritated by his statement. "Since my tank's basically empty, I'll drop 10 for the tank and be on my way. I know the tells of not being welcome somewhere, but I don't have a choice," I told him and tossed a crumpled $10 bill on his counter. He didn't say anything to me, and I walked briskly across the parking lot to my car, where I pumped my gas and kept my eyes on the station ahead of me and the road behind me. I didn't like what he said about the wrong party, and I know a minor threat when I hear one. But I also realized I wasn't currently in a position where an altercation would be ideal. Technically, even though I had the GPS, I was still in the middle of nowhere, and had a decent distance to go to get home. As soon as I was done pumping and was back inside my car, I heard the noisy engine of a truck roar up the road and into the parking lot of the gas station. And it was that same Ford with the Confederate flag on the back. And this time I could see it in its full glory. Red, rusted old truck easily from the 50s, with a complimentary Confederate license plate and several stickers on the back, most of which were images of guns and mantras like, "Come and take it." The one that read, "If you can read this, you're already dead," actually got to me. And I did start up my engine and begin to pull out of the parking lot as the 2 men emerged from the driver and passenger seat. I heard one of them yell something that sounded like, "Where you going, boy?" But I wasn't trying to stick around after that. I got back on the road and continued on my road trip back towards civilization. I don't know how long it was exactly, but I did end up back in an area that I knew, not too far from where I lived, and got a notification from DoorDash that I had an order to pick up from a local barbecue spot. It was for $25, and I hesitated, but if you know anything about dashing, when you have to spend some of your take on fuel, every sizable order after that looks ideal so you don't go home with less money. So I took the order. I pulled up to the barbecue place, went to the front counter, and avoided really dealing with anyone except the cashier, who was a younger lady with glasses. She informed me that my order was going to be ready in a few minutes and offered me to sit at the bar and wait for it, so that's what I did. The dining area was semi-empty, with a few people here and there eating or watching one of the many big screens stationed on walls where the patrons could see them. After what felt like forever, the cashier brought me a big brown paper bag with the order that I was supposed to take, and I headed for the front door. It was still raining considerably, but by this point I really didn't care. Until I saw that same Ford pickup truck roar into the parking lot. This time they stayed at the entrance of the parking lot, engine running, and I felt like they were watching me specifically. It only got worse when I got into my car and left, and they followed me. DoorDash does have a service for letting them know when you feel unsafe on an order, but DoorDash's helpline can be unreliable at best whenever you need it. So, instead, I called my wife and let her know what was happening. And I asked her to keep an eye on her Life 360 app, which both of us have since we both travel and drive for delivery apps alone sometimes. I hung up and kept an eye on my rearview mirror the entire time I navigated to the next stop, which took me a little out of the way from where I'd go to get home, but now I had another issue. They followed me up until I took a turn and entered a neighborhood to deliver the food, and then they drove off straight ahead. I thought, I wasn't sure if I was out of the woods at this point, but just as a note for any listeners, my wife and I have talked about crazy situations and plans to deal with them, and so we stayed prepared as much as we can. Our cars have dash cams, and we actually wear our own body cams when we drive, just as added evidence and security. We also have small backpacks we call fox packs, which are filled with supplies like flashlights, portable chargers, walkie-talkies, small toolkits, medkits, and yes, a few simple weapons of choice. We keep these items with us during our drives, just in case anything should happen. My wife actually has 2 different bags because she also rides a motorcycle, but I digress. As I exited the neighborhood, once I dropped off the food, I saw that the truck was actually waiting for me. And as soon as I turned right to get back onto the main road, they were right behind me again. At this point, I knew that I had enough evidence and confirmation that these guys were following me, so I actually did call 911. I told the dispatch my name, where I was currently heading, and that I was currently being followed by 2 guys in a truck with a gigantic Confederate flag on the back of it, and a brief description of the vehicle, driver, and passenger. They told me to stay on the line, and that where I was currently headed would intersect with patrols from the local town's police. A dispatch asked me if they were driving aggressively or using their vehicle to strike my own, and I told them that thus far they hadn't, but that they were bringing their truck all the way up to the rear of my car, which would make it impossible for me to slow down if I needed to. And I mentioned that I did have a dual-facing dash cam and recorded some of the activities of the night on it. Dispatch told me that officers were headed to my location and were going to intercept the vehicle that was tailing me in a few moments. And all I could do was keep on driving down the dark, rainy, 2-lane road until help arrived. I could hear the men whooping and saying indistinct things as they played this game, but all I could think was that they had no idea what was coming their way. In the distance, I did see headlights approaching quickly, and dispatch told me that an officer confirmed that he saw my car and the truck tailing me. The officer hit a sharp U-turn and flipped his lights on, which I guess spooked the 2 men in the truck, because they sped around me and took off down the road. But for some reason, the officer pulled up behind me and ordered me to pull over. He was from a small county in the area, and apparently he wanted to ask me questions about what happened, even though I told dispatch everything I could. So I cooperated, and even threw in that I had dashcam footage rolling the entire time and caught most of the action. The officer told me that we would get to that, and started asking me what I was doing out here at this time of night, where I lived and such. And before anyone says it, yes, I used to train police officers, and I understand there's a whole argument on what you should and shouldn't do, but in this situation, I kept my cameras going and took note that the officer let the two men escape. He took down my statements and information and said that their precinct would look into the situation, which I didn't believe. And I did ask the officer why he didn't pursue the men when he initiated a traffic stop and they fled. Well, look at who's using the big words, was all he had to say to me about that. He told me that his precinct had enough evidence to look into the pickup truck, including their license plate, and that they would handle it from there. He said they didn't need my dashcam footage, and even though he took down a statement from me, he didn't give me a card to confirm that there was an open case on the situation. I asked him about that, and he said that not every police station handles things the same way. Then told me that if they had any questions, they would give me a call. I insisted that something was off, and he told me flat to my face, "Don't go playing the hero or trying to make this a big issue. Be a good boy and stay out of trouble." When I tell you that my blood ran hot, that is an understatement. My wife was calling me at that point, so I did answer the phone, and the officer went back to his cruiser and left. As he passed, I saw him answering his personal phone with a grin on his face, and he sped off down the road. I told my wife what happened, and after a few minutes of literally fuming in anger, I went ahead and drove home. This is where my story ends, but just a heads up, there was a story that recently popped up in the local community group in our area about how apparently a man was found dead at the park on the 4th of July, and that the police were keeping the story out of the local news because they didn't want to cause a panic. Witnesses who found him reported seeing an old red pickup truck leaving that park in a hurry, but no one has been arrested nor identified. One of the shared photos circulating in the group was taken from a few yards away from the park, which was roped off by local police. In it, you see several officers, and the man that pulled me over that night standing right next to the mayor. I wanted to share the videos from my dash cam and body cam I have, but my wife said it's not a good idea because that officer purposefully let those men go, and got my information because I called the police on them. If I were to leak the footage, we believed it would have turned into a more severe situation. People can say what they wish, but the truth is, you don't know what you would do in a situation like that. And since these men aren't identified, and apparently the police don't care to stop them, it's an unfair advantage. We just won't be taking any more DoorDash orders in this area, and steering clear of dashing at night. Hi, Raven. These two stories happened within a few weeks of us moving into our first house in Derbyshire, UK. The house was about 80 years old. I'd gotten home from work and went into the kitchen to make a cup of tea, and there on the worktop was a small brass weight, the kind people used on those old-fashioned weighing scales. I picked it up thinking my partner, Jonathan, must have found it, and left it there that morning, as I had gone to work before him, so I wouldn't have been aware if so. So I made my tea, and then Jonathan arrived home. I showed him the weight and asked where he had found it. He looked totally surprised, stating that he had never seen it before, which I believed, because he was not the type of person to play tricks. We still have the weight, but we never figured out where it came from. The second story is about us in the same house a few weeks later. We were sat quietly reading late one evening in our living room, which was located off of the kitchen. Then suddenly we heard a bell ring. It came from the kitchen. It wasn't a doorbell because we didn't have one. It sounded more like one of those bells they have on hotel reception desks to alert staff that someone is at the desk and needing assistance. We both looked at each other, and I said, "Did you hear that?" Jonathan confirmed he had, but continued reading. He's not easily spooked. But I am, and I jumped up to peer into the kitchen, seeing nothing there that could have made the noise. We didn't have neighbors, and the road was not busy because of the time of night, and the noise definitely came from the kitchen. Jonathan then stated that he was going to bed, so I quickly followed him, saying, "Wait for me." It really spooked me, and it still gives me goosebumps when I tell the story to anyone. I hope you enjoy the stories. We stayed in that house for 17 years, and nothing else happened. And we never figured out what could have caused the two incidents to happen. Thanks. I love listening to your stories, and you have a great storytelling voice. Thank you. I think from time to time, everyone enjoys a good concert. I know that even I, an admitted shut-in, enjoy a good show from time to time. An exciting night out with friends, probably a few stiff drinks, and then a night of eardrum-blasting excitement full of your favorite songs, a light spectacle, and of course, the pyrotechnics. Who doesn't love a good pyro display? Well, actually, there are probably a few people who can't stand them anymore. And that's what our story today is about, pyro gone wrong. Though sadly, in the field of pyrotechnics, there are many examples of pyro gone wrong. One miscue, 1 second off in timing, being 1 inch out of position. Ask The Undertaker, Mark Calloway, or James Hetfield of Metallica. With pyrotechnics, there are so many things that can go wrong, and that's exactly why you can only use them in certain venues that are deemed safe, and with proper permits in place. That's what really makes the story that I'm about to share with you all so truly tragic. It was completely avoidable. So we go now to the night of the tragedy. West Warwick, Rhode Island, February 20th, 2003. At the station nightclub, people have gathered to come and watch a show headlined by an offshoot band of Great White, called Jack Russell's Great White. With 462 people in the crowd, the club was already over capacity, with the official capacity of the club cited as 404. The foundation of the disaster are already coming together. During the band's opening song, Desert Moon, the tour's manager, Daniel Bichelle, set off 4 pyrotechnics in the form of 4 gerbs. 2 of the gerbs in the center were facing straight up, with 2 flanking them at 45-degree angles. What the gerbs do are produce a controlled spray of sparks 15 feet for 15 seconds. Within seconds of the pyros going off, the acoustic foam caught fire and rapidly began to burn. The foam was on both sides, and top center above the drummer's alcove. Initially, it was assumed the fire was part of the act, and it wasn't until the fire reached the ceiling and the unventilated smoke began to get overwhelming that people began to realize otherwise. The band played for a full 20 seconds after the pyro had finished. When they stopped playing, the crowd began to back away from the stage, and the band's lead singer, Jack Russell, very calmly said, "Wow, that's not good." Within 40 seconds of the fire igniting, the band was off the stage as the club's fire alarm sounded, for what little good it did, as it was not connected to any local fire departments. The club also had no sprinkler system installed, so within a minute the fire was spreading and smoke filled the club. The fire was raging and there was nothing to slow it down. Within 6 minutes of the initial blaze starting, the entire club was engulfed. And at this point, we have to talk about something very grave, I'm afraid. Some of you may know or remember that there is actual footage of the fire that was recorded by one of the concertgoers that night. While I am certain that it probably still exists somewhere, I very respectfully ask that you not seek it out. Moving past all that, let's look into all the things that went wrong before the night of the calamity. It's a bumpy road, even getting to the night of the fire, as the club already had a history of issues and citations. The building itself was built in the late 1940s and had many occupants during its lifespan. In 1972, one such occupant was a restaurant called Julio's, who had a fire of their own during the time in the building. While there was no one in the building at the time, the interior of the building suffered significant damage. In 1991, the building was opened as a nightclub, which was purchased by brothers Michael and Jeffrey Derderian in 2000. In the months preceding the fire, they had been cited for 9 minor code violations. Yet, in both the November and follow-up inspection in December of 2002, the Warwick Fire Marshal, Dennis LaRoque, did not cite the polyurethane the club used for soundproofing, which was against code, because the foam is highly flammable. Later on, LaRoque would claim that he did not spot the foam during the November inspection because he had been upset over an illegal inward swinging door that he had previously asked to be removed. So, come the night of the concert in February of 2003, we have a perfect storm brewing. An overcrowded club that is not up to fire safety standards to begin with, that is now packed beyond capacity. Now, to be fair, the nightclub had been hosting heavy metal bands and 80s tribute bands that had used pyrotechnics, and everything had been fine. But that's how these things go, isn't it? When you're skirting the rules, everything is always fine right up to the moment that it isn't. And we know what the end result was, don't we? Well, kind of. An inferno engulfed the club in a matter of minutes. The second it became clear the blaze wasn't part of the show, the band abandoned the stage, and now we have 462 people panicking, all trying to find the exits. People were trampled in the ensuing stampede. So many people were trying to crowd out exits at one time that they were becoming hopelessly stuck and entangled, unable to free themselves with an unstoppable tide of more panicking patrons desperately trying to escape the smoke and flames. By the time everything was over, of those 462 concertgoers, 100 of them had tragically lost their lives. 230 of them suffered non-fatal injuries. An absolute tragedy, catastrophe. Whatever word you want to apply to it, it's probably befitting. The investigation that followed saw multiple civil and criminal cases filed. The person that had ignited the pyro, tour manager Daniel Bichelle, pleaded guilty to 100 counts of unintentional manslaughter in 2006, and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. However, he was released in 2008 after several families of victims advocated for his parole. The club's owners pleaded no contest and avoided trial. Michael received the same sentence as Bichelle, but was released in 2009, while Jeffrey received 500 hours of community service. Other legal actions were taken against Great White, as well as several other parties. As of 2008, all legal issues have been resolved, mostly in the form of financial settlements. All in all, not a great day for anyone. I honestly can't tell you how I feel about the way the aftermath was handled. So, with that story being told, I let the events stand for themselves, and allow you all to draw your own conclusions about that. This was a rough one, folks, and thanks for sticking through it.